A broken man, a desperate woman, a little girl standing barefoot in an icy creek, begging a stranger not to ride away. He had every reason to leave, but some moments don't let you go, and some choices change everything. Welcome to Westwind Tales, where the American West comes alive through stories of love, courage, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism found in the hearts of ordinary people. This story reminds us that redemption doesn't come from running away from our past. It comes from showing up, on time, for someone who needs us. And sometimes the family we were meant to have isn't the one we were born into. It's the one that finds us when we're ready to stop running. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
It was August in the year 1885, way out in the Wyoming Territory. Elijah Cross had his boots planted firm in the middle of Sweetwater Creek. The water, so cold it felt like it was searching for his bones, was climbing up past his knees. That current did its level best to knock him off his feet, but he had wrestled with worse things. The real chill was the one he carried deep inside, a cold that no mountain stream could ever wash away. Inside his saddlebag, he had just $3.17. His entire fortune was tied up in that beat-up piece of leather. The horse beneath him had seen better days. You could make out every single rib under its tired hide. But the animal was loyal, and that counted for a whole lot. A Colt revolver with 6 bullets sat snug in his holster. Those were the last rounds he would be buying for quite some time. At 35 years old, this was all he had to show for it. A man in a creek with pocket change and a gun he prayed he would never have to use again. It had been 8 long years. 8 years since he knelt on a bank floor in Silver Creek, Colorado, holding his brother Nathan while the life bled out of him. 8 years since Nathan looked him in the eye and whispered with his final breath, "Eli, I am sorry." Like any of it had been his fault. Like it was a mistake to trust that his big brother would protect him. 30 seconds. That was all it took. Eli had stormed through that door just 30 seconds too late. 30 seconds was the difference between a brother living and a brother dying. He unpinned his marshal's badge that same evening, walked away, and never once looked over his shoulder. For 8 years he was a ghost, drifting from one ranch to another, one town to another, never staying put long enough for folks to start asking questions, and certainly not long enough to make a promise he might not be able to keep. The sun was bearing down something awful. It was the kind of August heat that makes a man's shirt stick to his back and sends his thoughts to dark places. Eli's fingers traced the old scar on his left wrist, a perfect horseshoe branded into his skin. He got it on that terrible day, from grabbing the bank's door handle so hard the blistering metal seared him. That scar was a permanent reminder. He figured it always would be. He was just another drifter, looking for a day's work. That is the lie he told himself every morning. Just passing through. Just another cowhand. Just a shadow that nobody would remember after he was gone. And that is when he heard it, a small voice. "Mister, please, my mama is about to lose everything, and they are coming to take me away." Eli's horse spooked. He yanked the reins to settle the old animal and looked up. About 20 feet down the creek stood a little girl. She could not have been a day over 9. She was barefoot, the hem of her dress was torn, and her dark, tangled hair fell over her bony shoulders. She stood shin-deep in the water, hugging herself so tight she was trembling. It was not from the cold, though. It was from a fear that ran much, much deeper. On the bank behind her was a brown and white cattle dog with its tail tucked between its legs. The dog was barking up a storm, but it was not a normal bark. It was a cry of panic, the kind a dog makes when its entire world is falling apart. The little girl's hands were shaking so badly. From where he sat, Eli could see her small fingers trembling without pause. She looked up at him with enormous brown eyes that seemed too big for her face, and they were filled with a kind of pleading, a hurt that no child should ever have to carry. "Please, mister," she said again, her voice wavering. "Please, you have to listen." Every instinct in Eli's body told him to just keep moving, to pull on the reins, ford the creek, and disappear over the next rise. That is what he had been doing for 8 straight years. Town after town, problem after problem. It was never his business, never his fight. But this little girl, she was not moving an inch. She just stood there in the creek, shaking and begging with her eyes, like he was the last decent man in all of creation. "I am listening," Eli heard himself say, and he immediately wished he could take the words back. The girl's shoulders slumped in relief with a look so genuine it was almost painful to witness. "My name is Emma," she said. "Emma Brennan. My mama owns the ranch just up that hill. It is not a big place, but it is ours. My papa built it himself before he died. He has been gone 2 years now." Emma's voice was steady, but her lower lip trembled. "He got sick from the water. Mama is sure the mine upstream poisoned it, but nobody will listen to her. And now this man, Judge Wade, he says she cannot keep me. He says a woman all by herself is not a fit parent. He is coming this Monday with papers from the courthouse." Eli felt his jaw tighten. Monday. That was only 3 days from now. "Little girl, I am just a drifter," he said. "I do not know the first thing about dealing with judges or court papers." "You have got a good pair of hands, do you not?" Emma's voice suddenly had a spark in it. It was a tiny voice, but it was filled with fight. "Mama needs someone to help fix things up. Our fence is falling down. The barn roof has holes in it, and the pasture's choked with weeds. Judge Wade, he has been telling everyone in town that my mama cannot manage. And now they all believe him, because the place looks like it has been let go." She took another determined step toward him through the water. The dog on the bank let out a soft whine. "But my mama does care," Emma insisted. "She works until her hands are raw and bleeding. She just cannot do it all by herself. Monday is coming fast, and they are going to take me away unless somebody helps us." Eli just sat and stared at this little girl, standing in that cold creek, barefoot and trembling, but fighting for her mother with nothing but her words and a whole lot of spirit. A man can turn his back on a lot of trouble. He can ride right past people in need and convince himself it is not his place to get involved. But a child standing in the water begging for her mother, well, that is the kind of thing that will stop a man cold, whether he wants it to or not. "Where is this ranch?" Eli asked. A wave of pure relief washed over Emma's face, and it felt like it broke something loose inside of Eli, something he had kept locked away for 8 long years. "It is just over the hill," she said. "I can show you the way in 10 minutes. "I am not making any promises," Eli told her. "I will just take a look, that is all." "That is enough," Emma said. She finally turned and splashed out of the creek, called her dog, and started up a narrow trail without a single glance back. She was completely sure, absolutely certain that Eli would follow. For a long moment, Eli just sat on his horse in the middle of Sweetwater Creek. The water swirled around his horse's legs. The sun beat down on his shoulders. He had $3.17, 6 bullets in his gun, and a brand new promise he had already broken once before. He followed the girl. The ranch was on a small rise overlooking the valley, maybe a quarter of a mile from the creek. It was tucked against a line of cottonwood trees that offered some small escape from the brutal summer sun. Eli could see the problems long before he reached the gate. Fence posts were leaning in every direction, some of them snapped clean in two and lying in the dirt. The wire sagged so low that a small child could step right over it. The big barn door was hanging from a single hinge, swaying gently in the breeze. Weeds had completely overrun what must have once been a garden. A pair of horses stood in a pasture that was badly overgrown, their coats looking dull and their ribs showing. But the small cabin, that was a different story. The windows were perfectly clean. There were curtains inside, old and faded, but neat. Someone had planted flowers in a tin can sitting on the porch rail. The porch itself had been swept that very morning. Swept clean, even as everything else was falling apart around it. Somebody was putting up one heck of a fight to keep this place from being swallowed whole. The front door opened before Emma even reached the steps. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She looked to be about 32 or 33 years old. Her reddish-brown hair was pulled back into a severe bun, with loose strands framing a face that was worn by the sun and lined with worry. She wore a faded blue dress, patched at the elbows, covered by a work apron that had seen far better seasons. Her hands were rough and scarred, the kind a woman gets from tackling a man's chores for too long with no one to help. She was not holding a rifle or anything else for that matter. She just stood there on the porch, her eyes locked on her daughter and the stranger the girl had brought home. Her eyes were exhausted, shadowed with dark circles underneath. They were the eyes of a woman who had not known a peaceful night's sleep in months, maybe even years. Emma Catherine Brennan. The woman's voice was steady, but you could feel the tight wire of tension running through it. "What have you brought to my door this time?" "Mama, he is here to help us." "I told you to quit bothering folks." "I was not bothering him. I was asking. Papa always said there was a big difference." The woman's tired gaze moved to Eli. Her eyes were brown, the same as Emma's, but they held a hardness that made Eli's stomach twist. He felt her measuring him, saw the weariness that was so deep it seemed to be a part of her soul. And right under all that hurt, he saw a stubborn little flame of grit, the kind you find only in a person who has fought every single battle alone and has long since forgotten how to trust. Eli gave a slow tip of his hat. "Ma'am, your daughter found me down by the creek. She figured you might need a hand around this place." The woman's jaw set like stone. "My daughter has a habit of saying more than she should." "Mama." "Hush now, Emma." Her eyes stayed on Eli. "I appreciate the offer, mister, but I do not know you from a hole in the ground, and this family does not take charity." "This is not charity," Eli said, his voice even. "I am just headed north, looking for summer work. I can mend that fence for you. Rehang that barn door. Clear out that overgrown pasture. It would take a few days of work, and then I will be on my way." "A few days?" There was no warmth in the woman's voice. "Judge Wade gets here on Monday. That gives us 3 days. You really think fixing a fence in 3 days is going to convince a judge that I am a good mother?" Eli met her gaze and did not flinch. "I think 3 days of this place looking like someone cares for it might make a difference. I think a fence standing straight and a barn door that closes right might prove you have got help. It might prove you are not all alone out here." "But I am all alone." The words came out soft and broken. "I have been alone for 2 years, and pretending otherwise for 3 days is not going to change what is in Judge Wade's mind." Emma reached over and clutched her mother's hand. "Mama, please." The woman looked down at her little girl. A whole conversation passed between them without a single word, one Eli could not understand but could surely feel. It was a mother's terror tangled up with a daughter's unwavering hope. It was the crushing weight of 2 long years fighting a war they knew they could not win by themselves. The dog, Dusty, as Emma called him, padded over and sat by the woman's leg, looking up as if he too was waiting for the verdict. The woman breathed out a long, slow sigh. 3 days, she said at last. You can sleep in the barn. You will eat what we eat. And I am telling you now, it is not much. And if I catch you with a bottle, or if one single thing goes missing, or if you say one wrong word to my daughter, I swear to you I will fetch a gun and put you down myself. Do we understand each other?" As clear as glass, ma'am. The name is Kate, or Mrs. Brennan, if you must. I cannot abide, ma'am. It makes me think of my mother-in-law. Eli almost smiled. Almost. Emma gave a small, triumphant pump of her fist. I told you, Mama, I told you God would send somebody. Sent him. The good Lord did not send him, Emma. Kate's voice was thick with weariness. You trapped him down by the creek. There's a whole world of difference. But as she turned back to the house, Eli could see her shoulders drop just a fraction. It was a relief she would never admit to, a thankfulness she would never put into words, a tiny spark of hope she was too afraid to acknowledge. Eli tied his horse to the only solid fence post still standing and started to take stock of the work ahead. By the middle of the afternoon, Eli was in his shirt sleeves and had already sunk 4 new posts. The sun was a relentless hammer beating down on him. Sweat stung his eyes. His hands settled into the familiar rhythm of hard work, and his mind went quiet in that special way it only could when his body was pushed to its limit. Emma came out with a big jug of water. Mama figured you might be thirsty. She was right. Thank you kindly. Emma sat down in the dust, her legs crossed, and Dusty the dog curled up right beside her. She watched Eli with a serious, focused stare, the way a child does when they are trying to solve a puzzle. Do you have any kids? Emma asked. Eli's hands stilled on the post. No. Do you want any? I had a brother. Eli drove the post into the ground with more force than was needed. I raised him myself after our folks passed on. What happened to him? The post sank even deeper. Eli's knuckles were white as bone around the handle of the post hole digger. He is gone. Emma went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that already understood what gone really meant. She had seen it up close before. My papa is gone too, she said softly after a little while. Mama says that gone is not the same as forgotten. Your mama is a very smart woman. She is the smartest person in this entire county. Emma's voice filled with a fierce pride. She knew that water was bad before anybody else did. She told the doctor, she told the sheriff, and she told the judge. Her voice turned to ice on that last word, and not a single one of them paid her any mind. Papa died, just the same. Eli stopped his work completely, setting the digger down. He looked at this 9-year-old girl sitting in the Texas dust, her small hands trembling just a little as she spoke about her father's death, like it was a script she had been made to recite to 100 people who refused to hear. How did your papa die, Emma? He got sick. Her voice was flat, matter of fact, the way children sound when they have witnessed too much too early. He was real sick for a lot of months. His hands would not stop shaking. His stomach was always tied in knots. Doc Pierce said it was just a fever. But Mama, she never believed that for a second. What did your mama think it was? The mine? Emma's eyes became as hard as river stones. The Wade Mining Company. They started digging up the creek. Right after that, the water started to taste and smell wrong. Papa drank from our well every single day. He worked this land so hard he was always drinking water. 6 months after that mine opened, he could barely lift a hammer. A year later, we buried him. Emma drew a line in the dirt with her finger. Her hand was shaking more now. Eli could see it clearly. And nobody ever bothered to check on it? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Judge Wade said Mama was just being hysterical. Emma spat the word out like poison. That was the word he had for her. Called her hysterical. But she is not hysterical. She is dead right. Eli looked over at the little cabin. He could see Kate moving inside, busy getting their supper on the table. She moved with a real sense of purpose, her actions quick and sure, like a woman who had no time for foolishness and nobody to waste it on. What does Judge Wade want with your ranch? Eli asked. A shadow crossed Emma's face. He wants Mama to sell. The mining company is after this land. Papa told him no for as long as he was alive. Now Mama is the one telling him no. So, Judge Wade claims she is not a fit mother for me. He says a woman all by herself cannot raise a child right. A hard knot formed in Eli's stomach. He had run into this sort of mess before, back in the days when he wore a badge. Big, powerful men who used the law like a hammer, bending it to fit their own greedy plans. "When is he coming?" Eli asked. "Monday morning. He walked right onto our porch last week, him and that Deputy Carter. He was holding papers that looked all official." Emma's bottom lip began to tremble. "Mama stood right there on that porch and told him to get off her land. He just said he would be back on Monday to take me away. He said it was for my own good." The bell for supper rang out across the yard. Kate was standing on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Emma, Mr. Cross, it is time to wash up." Emma jumped to her feet. About halfway to the cabin, she paused and looked back. "Mr. Eli." "Yes. You are not thinking about leaving before Monday, are you? You said you would stay for 3 days. That takes you right past Monday." "I said 3 days, and I meant every word of it." Emma gave him a smile so bright it felt like it broke something loose deep inside Eli's chest. A place he had kept locked down, tight since the day Nathan died, a place that hurt just to feel anything again. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she ran for the cabin, her dog Dusty right at her heels. Eli stood alone in the yard, his hands clutching the fence post. 3 days. He had 3 days to fix a fence and maybe, just maybe, make some kind of difference. 3 days until a judge was set to arrive and tear a family into pieces. He had failed Nathan when it mattered most. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could be of some help to this family. Maybe. Supper was a plain meal. Some salt pork, a pot of beans, and fresh cornbread. Kate set the plates on the table without saying a thing. Emma offered a quick, sincere prayer, and they all ate in silence for a spell. "This is mighty good, Ma." "Kate," Eli corrected himself. "It is just food. It will keep you going." Kate did not even lift her eyes from her plate. "It is what we have." "Mama's cornbread won first prize at the county fair," Emma said brightly, "back when folks in town still talked to us." The table went completely still. Kate's fork stopped in midair. She put it down slow and steady. "Emma, it is true, Mama. Mrs. Crawford told everybody your cornbread was the best she had ever put in her mouth. Then, after Papa passed and you started asking all those questions, Mrs. Crawford began acting like she did not even recognize us in town." A muscle jumped in Kate's jaw. "Emma, eat your beans? But Mr. Eli should know. If he is going to be here for 3 whole days, he should know why everyone turns their back on us." Kate finally raised her eyes to meet Eli's. In them, he saw a woman standing at a crossroads trying to decide whether she could risk trusting this stranger who was sitting in her husband's chair at the dinner table. "My husband was killed by mercury poisoning." Her voice was flat, like she had said it 100 times before. It was the voice of a woman who had told her truth to too many men in authority who refused to hear it. "The Wade mining companies digging up the creek fouled our well water. Thomas drank from that well every single day. He worked this ranch from sunup to sundown, and he drank water to keep his strength just like any good man would. 6 months later, he could not even hold on to his tools. A year after that, he was in his grave." "And you have proof of this?" Eli asked gently. "I know it in my soul." Kate's hands tightened around her fork, but proving it is another matter entirely. Doc Pierce wrote down "fever of unknown origin" on the death certificate. The mining company owns Judge Wade, lock, stock, and barrel. Wade controls the town council, he controls the sheriff, he controls the land office. He controls every last thing in this county. Why does he want your land so badly? Kate's eyes narrowed. "Because our ranch is sitting on top of the biggest vein of silver they have not yet reached. They must have this land to dig deeper. Thomas would not sell when he was alive. And I will not sell now that he is gone." So Wade thought up another way. "By taking your daughter. If the court rules that I am an unfit mother, they will appoint a guardian. Wade will make sure that guardian is someone he can manage, someone who will sell this land to settle debts." Her voice cracked just for a moment. "Debts that are not even real." Kate's hands were shaking. "Now." She pressed them flat against the tabletop as if she could force them to be still. "They murdered my husband," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "Now they are trying to take my daughter and my home. And this entire town just stands by and watches it happen because Victor Wade signs their paychecks and buys their silence." Emma reached her small hand across the table and placed it on top of her mother's. Kate looked down at that little hand, at the fingers that shook just like hers did, just like Thomas's had in those last awful months. "We are not going to let them, Mama," Emma said. Kate covered Emma's hand with both of hers and squeezed it tight. "No, sweetheart, we are not." Eli set his fork down. "Who else got sick from that water?" Kate looked up at him, her expression confused. "What?" "If the mine polluted your well, it surely polluted others downstream." "Who else got sick?" Kate was silent for a long while, her eyes looking far away as she thought back over 2 years of being shunned and dismissed. "The Henderson boy, he had the shakes for about a year," she said slowly. "Old man Patterson's cattle started dying off. Martha Webb's little girl, she has been sickly from the day she was born, but no one ever connected it to the mine." "You connected it?" Nobody wanted to listen. Kate's voice hardened again. "Wade put out the story that Thomas died of typhoid fever. That is a whole lot easier for people to accept than the truth. The truth means the mine has to shut down. The truth means Wade loses a fortune. The truth means this town loses its jobs. Nobody wants the truth, Mr. Cross." "Eli!" She stopped what she was doing and simply looked at him. "Why would you do that? You are leaving in 3 days. That may be so, but I am here right now." Kate just watched him from her side of the table. The lamplight between them cast shadows on her face, making her eyes look darker, more guarded. She was trying to figure him out, trying to understand what kind of man just sits down with a stranger and offers to take up their fight. "What is it you want from us?" she asked at last. The question hung in the still air of the room. Eli knew what she was really asking. What was his angle? What did he expect in return? In Kate's experience, nobody ever offered a helping hand for nothing. No one was going to defend a widow and her daughter without wanting something back. "Nothing," Eli said, plain and simple. "I do not want a single thing from you." "Then why would you help?" Eli's hand tightened on his coffee cup. "Because 8 years ago, someone needed my help, and I arrived 30 seconds too late," he said, his voice low. "I have been running from that moment ever since. Your daughter stood in that creek today and told me to stop running. So I did." Kate's expression did not change, but he saw something flicker in the depths of her eyes. It was not trust, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. It was the first small crack in a wall she had built up high and strong from 2 years of fighting this battle all alone. "Monday is in 3 days," she said. "I know that Wade has the law on his side. He has the money. He has this entire town scared into silence. I know that too. 3 days of mending fences is not going to change anything." Eli leaned forward just a little. "Well then, we had better come up with something that will." Kate met his gaze and held it for a long second. Then she stood up and started to clear the plates from the table. Emma helped her, moving around the small kitchen, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. They worked together without a word, a mother and her daughter. They were a team that had learned how to get by with 2 people doing the work of 3. Eli carried his own plate to the wash basin. Kate took it from him without a look. "There is a lantern out in the barn," she told him, "and some blankets in the tack room. It is not much. It is more than enough. Breakfast is at dawn. We start our day early here." "Yes, ma'am." The corner of her mouth pulled up, almost a smile. "I told you not to call me ma'am." "Yes, Kate." And that time she truly did smile. It was a small thing. It was only there for a moment. And then it vanished, swallowed up by the exhaustion that seemed to be carved into every line of her face. Eli walked to the barn as the sun sank behind the mountains. The sky blazed in shades of purple and gold, so beautiful it was almost painful to see. He had not taken the time to notice a sunset in 8 long years. He had not paid attention to much of anything, really, except the bottom of a whiskey bottle in the next road out of whatever town he was trying to forget. The barn was just as Kate had described it. Simple. There was a stall for his horse, bales of hay stacked high in a corner, and a tack room filled with saddles that had seen better days. He found the blankets right where she told him they would be and spread them out on some clean hay in an empty stall. His horse had already settled right in, munching on some hay and looking perfectly pleased with himself. Eli found a hay bale, sat down, and pulled his tired boots off. Every muscle in his body was screaming. But it was the good kind of hurt, the kind that comes from a day of real work. It had been a long, long time since he had felt that. Through a gap in the barn boards, he had a clear view of the little cabin. A single window shone with the warm glow of a lamp. He could make out Kate's shadow as she moved behind the thin curtain. He saw her sit down at her table. She was all by her lonesome now that Emma was tucked in bed. He watched as she buried her face in her hands. She sat just like that for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Eli had to look away, to give the woman her peace. But that image was seared into his memory. A woman sitting all alone at a table in the lamplight, bearing a weight that no soul should ever have to bear on their own. He leaned back into the hay and looked up at the rafters. Through the spaces between the roof planks, he could see the stars scattered all across the night sky. He made a mental note to patch that roof come morning, another job on his growing list. The fence, the barn door, the roof, the pasture. It was 3 days of labor. 3 days to try and make some small bit of difference. His thoughts drifted back to Nathan, to that bank in Silver Creek, and to showing up a mere 30 seconds too late to change a single thing. Nathan had been so young, just 22 years old, and so full of fire to prove his worth. He wanted to be a lawman, to be just like his older brother. Eli was the one who got him the deputy spot, trained him personally, taught him how to handle a gun, how to judge a man's character, how to keep himself safe. He had taught him every last thing, except how to survive when his own brother shows up 30 seconds too late. The light in the cabin window went dark. Eli shut his eyes and tried to find some sleep, but it just would not come. Around midnight, he gave up the fight, sat himself up, and decided he ought to check on the barn just to make sure he had not overlooked something in the dim light. Kate had been kind enough to offer him a place to stay. The very least he could do was make sure her property was secure. He lit his lantern and made a slow walk through the barn. It was in far better condition on the inside than it appeared from the outside. You could tell someone had taken pride in it as best they could, kept the floors swept clean, stored the grain properly, and maintained the tack, even if it was well worn. Thomas Brennan must have been a decent man. Eli could tell that just by the state of his barn. A man's barn tells you a whole lot about his character. Back in the tack room, Eli's eyes fell on a shelf with some supplies. There were some nails, a bit of wire, a handful of tools, and then, hidden behind a crate of horseshoes, he spotted something that did not seem to belong. It was a leather-bound journal, and Eli reached for it and ran his hand over the cover. The leather was high quality, and the book was well made, the kind of thing a man would use to keep track of important matters. He knew good and well he should not be reading it. It was none of his concern. But something inside him just compelled him to open it up. On the very first page, a name was written in a neat, steady hand. Thomas Brennan, and just below it, a date, January 1883. Eli began to turn the pages. They were filled with daily notes, observations on the weather, remarks about the horses, and his plans for the crops. It was all the simple, everyday details of running a small ranch. But then, the tone of the entries began to shift. March 15th, 1883. The water from our well has a strange taste, like metal. Kate has mentioned it too. April 2nd, 1883. My hands were trembling this morning. I could not even hold my coffee cup without spilling. I told her it was just the morning chill, but it is not a bit cold outside. April 30th, 1883. The Wade Mining Company has started blasting at a new site upstream. I saw them do it yesterday. The creek water ran gray for a solid hour. May 10th, 1883. The pains in my gut are getting worse. Doc Pierce keeps saying it is nothing to fret about. He gave me some laudanum, but it does no good. June 1st, 1883. I can barely get through a full day's work anymore. My hands shake something fierce. Kate is worried to death. Emma asked me why Papa cannot carve her little wooden animals for her anymore. I just said I was feeling tired. The journal entries continued just like that, 1 month after another. Thomas Brennan was documenting the story of his own slow and painful demise, putting together the clues that no one else was paying attention to, building a case inside his journal that he would never get to present himself. Eli's throat felt tight as a drum. He kept reading. November 4th, 1883. I spoke with old man Patterson. His cattle are dying. They have the same sickness I do. I also spoke to Henderson. His boys' hands are shaking too. Every one of us lives downstream from that new mine. December 12th, 1883. Wade paid a visit to the house today. He offered to buy our ranch, a fair price, he called it. I told him no. He did not take that well at all. He said I was just being a stubborn fool, said a sick man has no business running a ranch. I told him to get the hell off my property. January 3rd, 1884. Doc Pierce came by, gave me an examination. I saw something in his eyes. The man was scared. He knows. He knows exactly what is happening, and he is too afraid to say it. Eli turned the pages faster now. The handwriting was becoming more erratic, much more difficult to make out. Thomas's hands were betraying him even as he struggled to write down the truth. March 20th, 1884. I have collected water samples. 3 jars. 1 from our well. 1 from the creek upstream, and another from the creek downstream. He told me he sealed them shut with wax. Kate is completely unaware. If anything should happen to me, she'll need some kind of proof. Eli froze right where he stood. He read that passage a second time. Water samples. Thomas had gathered his own evidence, stashed it somewhere safe, and Kate didn't have a clue. The very next entry was marked April 12th, 1884. I've hidden the samples where Emma knows. It's our special fishing hole. The one spot Wade can't ever find them. I told Emma to remember the willow tree and the big old rock. She will remember. She's a smart girl, just like her mama. Eli felt his own hands begin to tremble. He flipped to the final entry. April 30th, 1884. I can't write much longer. My hands are getting too bad. Tell Kate I am sorry. Tell Emma that I love her. Tell them both I did my best to fight. The water samples are the truth. The truth has to matter even when I'm gone. The writing simply stopped right there. Eli glanced at the front of the journal again. Thomas had passed away in May of 1884. He must have written that last part just days before he died. He used the last ounce of his strength to put down the truth, to make certain that someone, someday, would find out what truly happened. Eli just sat there in that tack room holding a dead man's words. It was the story of a murder, written by a failing hand. It was the proof that Kate had been right all along, proof that Thomas Brennan was poisoned by Wade's mine, that he knew it, wrote it all down, and that he hid samples of it before he died. Samples that his little girl Emma knew how to find. Eli's thoughts were racing. Monday was only 3 days off. Wade was on his way with legal documents to seize this land and to take Emma. But if they could just locate those samples, if they could get them tested, if they could prove that Thomas was telling the truth. He got to his feet, holding the journal tight against his chest. He looked over at the cabin where Kate was supposed to be sleeping, worn out, but probably not sleeping a bit, likely just lying there staring at the rafters, stewing over what Monday was going to bring. He had to tell her. He had to show her what was in this journal. He had to give her the one thing she'd been searching for all this time, a little bit of hope. Eli blew out the lantern, walked across the yard to the little cabin, and gave a quiet knock on the door. A minute passed, then another. He knocked again, a little softer this time. The door creaked open. Kate stood there in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes heavy from a sleep that wouldn't come. "What's wrong?" Her voice was sharp, instantly awake. "Is Emma all right?" "Emma's fine." But I found something in the barn, something you have to see. Kate grabbed for a shawl, wrapped it around her shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. She eased the door shut behind her so they wouldn't disturb Emma. What is it? Eli held the journal out to her. It's Thomas's journal. He wrote everything down. Everything he saw in the water, everything about getting sick, about the mine. Kate accepted the journal from him like it was made of delicate glass. She opened it with trembling hands, saw her husband's script, and let out a sound that was not quite a cry. I never saw this, she whispered. I looked all over for it after he passed. I figured maybe he'd just given up. Something down, but I couldn't quite place it. He had it tucked away in the tack room, out in the barn. Eli took a deep breath. Kate, there's a part in here from April. He collected some water samples, 3 of them, one from the creek up the way, and another one from downstream. Kate's head snapped up. What? He sealed them up real good, and he hid them. It says right here that Emma knows the spot. Tears started to well up in Kate's eyes. She clutched the journal to her chest. Water samples, real hard proof. If we can get our hands on them, if we can have them tested, we'll have actual evidence, Eli said, finishing her thought. Real, solid evidence. Not just her word against all of Wade's money. This was science, proof that the mine had fouled their water. Kate was truly crying now, silent tears just streaming down her face. She didn't try to wipe them away, just stood there on that porch in the moonlight, holding her late husband's journal and letting herself cry for what felt like the first time in ages. Thomas, she whispered, you brilliant, stubborn old coot. Eli gave her a moment, looking away to give her the privacy to grieve for her husband. The man who loved her so much he spent his last days on this earth gathering the proof she would need when he was gone. Finally, Kate wiped her face, straightened her shoulders, and looked at Eli with something he hadn't seen in her eyes before. It was fire. Emma's secret fishing spot, she said. Willow Creek, down by the big rock. I know exactly where that is. Thomas used to take her there every Saturday. We go tomorrow, Eli said, his voice low. Early, before anyone in that town is even thinking about getting up. Kate just gave a nod. Then she looked back at the journal, at her husband's writing. Why did you bring this to me tonight? She asked. You could have waited until morning. Because you've been sitting in that cabin for 2 long years believing you were losing your mind, Eli said gently. Believing that not a single soul believed you, maybe even starting to wonder if you were wrong. You needed to know tonight that you are not crazy. And you are not wrong. Thomas knew it. He wrote it all down. He left you the proof. Kate's chin began to quiver. She pressed her lips together in a firm line, holding herself together with pure grit. Thank you, she managed to get out in a whisper. Don't thank me. You thank Thomas. Kate looked at the journal one last time, tracing her fingers over her husband's name on the cover. I miss him, she said. It was so quiet. Eli almost didn't catch it. Every single day I miss him, and every day I have to find the strength for the both of us, for Emma, for this entire fight. And Lord, I am so very tired of being strong all on my own. Eli didn't know what to say to that. He didn't have the right words for that kind of bone-deep weariness, that kind of loneliness. So he just stood there with her under the moon. 2 people who had lost far too much, standing on a porch in the middle of nowhere, holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they were not as alone as they felt. Get some sleep, Eli said finally. Tomorrow we find those samples. Then we'll figure out what comes next. Kate nodded, turned to go inside. But then she paused at the door. Eli? Yeah? 3 days might not be enough time. Then I'll stay longer. She looked at him, really sizing him up, trying to understand why some drifter would make a promise like that, why a complete stranger would decide to get mixed up in someone else's fight. Why, she asked. It was the same question she had asked him at supper. But it felt different now, quieter, with more substance behind it. Eli's hand drifted to the scar on his wrist. Because 8 years ago I didn't stay. And somebody died because I left too early. I'm not going to make that same mistake twice. Kate gave a slow nod, went inside, and closed the door. Eli stood on the porch by himself, looking up at the stars. They were so bright out here, far from any town, far from everything. Just stars, and a whole lot of quiet and the weight of promises made to folks who desperately needed them. Monday was only 3 days away. Judge Wade was coming to town. But tomorrow, they were going to find Thomas Brennan's water samples, and maybe, just maybe, the truth would be enough to make a difference. Eli walked back to the barn and laid down in the hay. His hand found that old scar on his wrist. He traced its shape in the dark. It was too late for Nathan. But maybe this time, 3 days would be exactly what Emma and Kate needed. Maybe. Dawn arrived cold and clear. Eli was already up when the first hint of light hit the mountains. He had probably slept for 3 hours, kept waking up to the sound of pure stillness. The quiet out here was different from the quiet in town. It was deeper, more honest somehow. He walked down to the creek and splashed the icy water on his face. The shock of it jolted him fully awake. His own reflection looked back at him from the water's surface. It was the same face he had seen for 8 long years, the same scar on his wrist, the same eyes that had watched his brother pass away. But something felt different this morning. A purpose. That's what it was. For the first time in 8 years, Eli had a purpose that actually meant something. Kate was already up and in the kitchen when he entered the cabin. She had made coffee, the kind that was strong and black enough to stand a spoon up in. She passed him a mug without a word. She had dark circles under her eyes, but her gaze was clearer than it was yesterday. It was focused. "Emma is still asleep," Kate said in a low tone. "I figured we should talk first." "I agree." They sat down at the small table. The journal was resting right between them. Kate had been reading it again. Eli could tell by the way the pages were dog-eared, the way it was open to a specific entry. "He knew he was dying," Kate said. Her voice was as steady as a stone, but her hands were trembling just a little around her coffee mug. "Read these pages from April. He knew. And instead of resting, instead of spending that time with us, he used his last days on this earth to collect evidence. He was fighting for you, for Emma. He was fighting for every family downstream." Kate looked up. "That was Thomas for you. Always seeing the bigger picture. Always worried about the next family down the line, the next generation." Her voice cracked. "I just wanted him to think about us, just for a little while. To rest, to let me look after him." Eli did not say a word. Sometimes staying quiet says more than empty phrases ever could. Kate quickly wiped her eyes, angry with herself for showing weakness. "We have got to find those samples before Wade gets any idea we have this journal, before he realizes Thomas wrote down everything." "Does Wade know about this journal?" "I don't believe so. Thomas hid it real well. But Wade is no dummy. He's going to be wondering just what Thomas might have left behind." Emma appeared in the doorway, her hair a mess from sleep, still in her little nightgown, with Dusty following right at her heels like he always did. "Mama, why are you awake so early?" Kate's entire expression softened. The sorrow just melted away, replaced by a smile that almost looked genuine. "Good morning, sweetheart. Come on over here." Emma crawled right up into her mother's lap. She was getting too big for it, really, at 9 years old. But Kate clutched her all the same, holding her as if she feared someone might try to snatch her away. "Emma," Kate said in a soft voice, "Mr. Eli found something. It was your papa's journal. Do you remember your papa keeping a journal?" Emma nodded her head against her mother's shoulder. "He wrote in it every single night at the table after I'd gone to bed. He wrote about a special place, your secret fishing spot where you and Papa used to go." Emma pulled away just a bit, looking up at her mother with those wide brown eyes. "Down by Willow Creek, by the big rock where Papa carved our names?" "That's the very one." Kate gently pushed the hair from Emma's face. "Your papa hid something out there, something very important, and we need your help to go and find it." "What did he hide?" "Some water, and some little glass jars. Do you reckon you could show us exactly where?" Emma's face just lit up with excitement. "I know the exact spot. Papa showed me. He told me it was our secret, just between us." Eli set down his coffee mug. "How far of a walk is it?" "About a 20-minute walk through the woods," Kate answered. "There's a little path. Thomas and Emma used to go in the early mornings before the rest of the world was even awake." "Then we should go now, before the town starts to get busy, before anybody sees us leave." They got dressed as quick as they could. Kate changed into her riding skirt, pulled on some boots, and put on a wide-brimmed hat. She carried herself differently this morning. Every one of her movements had a new purpose. Yesterday she had looked completely worn down, like she had given up the fight. Today she was a woman with a mission. Emma was practically jumping out of her skin with excitement. "Can Dusty come with us?" "Dusty's coming," Eli said. "It never hurts to have a good dog along." They slipped out the back of the property, following a narrow trail that snaked its way through the cottonwood trees and sagebrush. The morning air was cool, the birds were singing, and it was the kind of peaceful morning that sometimes comes right before a storm you don't even see gathering. Emma took the lead, with Dusty darting ahead, then circling back to check on them, then running on again. That dog knew this path by heart. He had probably walked it 100 times with Emma and Thomas. Kate walked silently beside Eli. Her hand kept finding its way to her pocket where she had put the journal, just to feel it, to make sure it was still there, to make sure she had not just dreamed the whole thing. It all up. "Thomas brought her out here every Saturday morning," Kate said, her voice quiet. 5 in the morning. They would fish for trout and be back by 7 with breakfast. Emma would tell me every story about what Papa taught her, how to read the current, how to have patience. Her voice grew even softer. She lived for those mornings with him. She still does. I can hear it in her voice when she talks about him. Kate took a sideways glance at Eli. "You are good with her. Good with children. I raised my brother from the time he was 10. I suppose I learned a thing or two." "What happened to him? Your brother?" Eli's jaw clenched. The old scar on his wrist began to burn. "He died because I was not around when he needed me most. That is the only thing that matters." Kate did not press him, just walked beside him in silence, giving him the same kind of space he had offered her the night before. The trail widened into a small clearing. Willow Creek flowed right through it, running clear and quick. A massive granite boulder sat right where the creek made a sharp bend. An ancient willow tree grew beside it, its roots thick and gnarled, reaching right down into the water. Emma ran straight for the tree, Dusty barking and wagging his tail like a wild thing. "Here!" Emma pointed to the trunk. "Look, Papa carved our names." Eli stepped closer to see, and there in the bark, etched by a steady and loving hand, were the initials T.B. and E.B., Thomas Brennan and Emma Brennan. The letters were weathered but cut deep, made with love, made to last forever. "Papa said this was our spot for all time," Emma said. "Nobody else's, just ours." Kate knelt down by the big rock. Her hands ran her hand over the granite, feeling for any kind of sign. Thomas had written that he hid them in a place only Emma would know. "Now, where is it, darling? Where would your papa put something this important?" Emma thought hard, her little face all scrunched up with focus. And then a smile spread clear across her face. The secret spot between the roots. She scrambled on over to the base of that big old willow tree. The roots had twisted up into a perfect little hollow right where they met the giant boulder. Emma started digging with her bare hands. Dusty the dog jumped in to help, his paws throwing dirt every which way. "Be careful now, Emma," Kate warned her. "Don't you go breaking anything." Emma's small fingers touched something hard. "I found it, Mama. I found it." She worked a little wooden box loose from the earth. It was about the size of a loaf of bread and all wrapped up in oilcloth. That cloth was still good, had kept the box dry for a whole year. Kate took the box with hands that were shaken and set it on the boulder. She unwrapped that oilcloth real slow and careful. Inside were 3 glass jars sealed up tight with dark wax, and each one had a label in Thomas's neat handwriting. Well Water, Brennan Ranch, April 10th, 1884. Creek water upstream of Wade Mine, April 10th, 1884. Creek water downstream of Wade Mine, April 10th, 1884. Kate pulled those jars to her chest and let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a cry. It was a noise of sorrow and triumph all mixed together, a sound with no name. "He did it," she whispered. "That stubborn, wonderful man of mine. He knew he was dying, and he still went and got the proof." Emma wrapped her arms tight around her mother's waist. "Papa left us exactly what we needed, Mama. He knew. He always knew what to do." A knot formed in Eli's throat. He turned his head away to give them a private moment. His hand went right to the scar on his palm without him even thinking about it. His brother Nathan never got a chance like this one. He didn't leave behind any proof. He didn't leave any chance for justice. All he left was his blood on a bank floor and a brother who showed up just a couple of minutes too late. But Thomas Brennan had fought back. Even while he was dying from poison, with his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold a pen, he still fought. He had collected his proof, hidden it away, and made sure his family had the tools they needed after he was gone. That was a kind of bravery Eli had never seen before. "We need to get going," Eli said in a low voice. "We have to get these to a safe place." Kate nodded, wiped the tears from her cheeks, and stood up. "Not back at the ranch. Wade could ride up with a search warrant and tear the whole place apart. Who can you trust? I mean, who can you really, truly trust?" Kate thought for a second. "Henry Webb. He owns the blacksmith shop in town. He was Thomas's best friend, and he is the only one who still talks to me. Can he keep his mouth shut? He kept Thomas's secrets for 20 years. He'll keep this one." Eli looked at the 3 jars. "We'll split 'em up. We leave one with Webb, I'll take one, and we'll bury the last one right back here in this spot. That way, if Wade ever finds one of them, there are still 2 more out there." Kate just looked at him. "You sound like a lawman." "I was, a long time ago." Her eyes got wide. "You were a deputy marshal for 3 years in a different territory." He picked up one of the jars and tucked it safe inside his shirt. "Right now, it just means I know how proof works. And I know how men like Wade think. Why? Did you quit being a marshal?" Her hand was still resting on the jar. "Because someone I was sworn to protect ended up dead, and there was nothing I could do to change it." Kate didn't say anything for a moment. "So you're trying to change things now?" He didn't answer her. He couldn't. Emma tugged on his sleeve. "We should go. Deputy Carter sometimes rides his horse down this trail." They put the 3rd jar back into the hollow, covered it up nice and neat, and scattered some leaves over the top so it looked like nobody had been there. Emma stepped back, looking mighty pleased. Papa would be proud. "We're keeping his secret safe." "Yes, he would, honey," Kate said. She took Emma by the hand. "Let's go home." They moved fast back through the woods. Eli carried Kate's jar, which was wrapped up in a cloth. Emma and Dusty ran on ahead, peeking out into the clearings and then waving them forward when everything was safe. They came out of the trees, right behind their barn. Kate stopped cold. A horse was tied to the front porch railing. It was a big chestnut mare with a fancy silver-trimmed saddle. "That's Deputy Carter's horse," Emma whispered. Kate shoved the jar into Eli's hands. "Hide this, right now." Eli ducked into the barn. He found an empty stall way in the back, wrapped the jar in an old horse blanket, and buried it deep underneath a pile of loose hay. He made sure it looked like nothing had been touched. By the time he came back out, Kate was already on the porch. Deputy Carter was leaning against the railing with his thumbs hooked in his belt. Carter was about 35, with a neck as thick as a fence post. He wore a star that looked a little too big for the man it was pinned on. He smiled when he saw Kate, but it was a smile that was cold and empty. It was the smile of a man who enjoyed having power over folks who couldn't fight back. Mrs. Brennan, Carter said, his voice as slick as snake oil. Just thought I'd stop by and check in. Judge Wade wanted me to make sure you and the little girl are doing all right. We are fine, Deputy. Kate's voice was pure ice. I see you've still got that drifter hanging around. Carter's eyes moved over to Eli, who was standing near the barn. Folks in town are starting to talk. Let them talk. Now, Mrs. Brennan, that's not a smart way to be. Carter pushed himself off the railing and took a step toward her. A woman in your position, with things the way they are, you need to be thinking about how things look. Judge Wade is a fair man. He would surely hate to see anything happen that might make Monday harder than it has to be. Kate's back went straight as a board. Monday. The day he's planning to take my daughter from me. The day he's planning to look after the girl's welfare. Carter's smile got even wider. There's a difference. Get off my porch, Deputy. Carter put his hands up like he was surrendering, but he was just mocking her. Just being a good neighbor, ma'am. Oh, and Mrs. Brennan. He tipped his hat with a little too much flair. The judge said to tell you he'd be willing to settle all this without going to court. If you would just rethink his offer on the land, it would save everybody a whole lot of trouble. This land is not for sale. Everything is for sale, ma'am. It all just depends on the price. Carter swung himself up onto his horse. His eyes looked over the property, noticing the new fence posts Eli had put in just yesterday, and the barn door that now hung perfectly straight. His gaze settled on Eli for a long moment. Your hired hand does good work, Carter said. It's a shame he won't be around long enough to see the job through. He kicked his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. Kate stood there perfectly still until the sound of the horse's hooves disappeared completely. Then her shoulders sagged. For just 1 second, her strong front crumbled, showing the woman underneath who had been fighting this war all by herself for way too long. Emma pressed herself against her mother's side. He scared me, Mama. Kate knelt down so she was looking right into her daughter's eyes. That's why he came here, honey, to make us afraid, to remind us that Judge Wade is always watching and that we aren't safe. But we have Papa's samples now. Doesn't that mean we win? Kate glanced over at Eli, then looked back at Emma. It means we have a chance. That's all. Just a chance. Emma's little face drooped. That's not enough. Sometimes a chance is all you get in this world, Eli said. He walked over to the porch and sat on the step. And you have to fight like hell to make that chance mean something. Emma sat down right next to him. Dusty the dog laid down across both their feet. Mr. Eli, are you scared? Yes. Papa always said, people only make threats when they're the ones who are scared. Deputy Carter came here because Judge Wade is getting nervous. That means we must be doing something right. Eli looked down at this 9-year-old girl. Her hands might have been shaking, and her body was slowly being poisoned, but her mind was as sharp as a tack. She was seeing the things that most grown-ups would miss, understanding the cruel game they were all being forced to play. That papa of yours was a sharp man, Eli told her. He was the sharpest, Emma agreed, resting her head on Eli's arm. Do you think he can see us from up in heaven? Do you reckon he knows we found his samples? A tightness came to Eli's throat. He thought of Nathan, wondering if the folks who passed on could still watch over the living. He wondered if his brother knew he'd spent 8 long years just trying to outrun his own regret. Yeah, Eli said, his voice low. I reckon he knows. From the porch, Kate watched the two of them. There was her daughter, and there was this stranger who had rolled in only 3 days ago. Emma had taken a liking to Eli right from the start, trusting him without a second thought. Kids just have a way of knowing about people. Kate had learned to trust those feelings, but putting your faith in a drifter was a risky business. Trusting anybody was risky after a whole town had turned its back on you. Still, Eli had found the journal, helped find the samples, and swore he would stay. Maybe, just maybe, he was made of something different. We are going to see Henry Webb tonight, Kate announced, after Emma is down for the night. We cannot risk being seen riding to town together in the daylight. Eli gave a nod. What about Emma? Who is going to stay here with her? Kate's expression tightened. I hate the thought of leaving her. But we cannot take her with us. If something was to go wrong, nothing is going to go wrong. We will ride in after dark. We give Webb the sample. We will be back inside of an hour. And what if Carter has men watching the roads? Then we will not be taking the roads. They waited until the moon was high in the sky. Emma had drifted off to sleep an hour earlier, plumb tuckered out from the excitement of the morning. Kate gently covered her with a blanket, placed a kiss on her forehead, and stayed there for a moment. It is something mothers do when they are scared that any night could be their last. Dusty stayed with Emma. The dog would not budge from the little girl's side. Kate was grateful for that. Eli saddled up Kate's mare and his own horse. They rode without lanterns, letting the moonlight guide their way. Kate knew every last trail, every shortcut, and every dark patch of trees. The ride took no more than 30 minutes. They came into town from the north, staying far from Main Street and keeping to the back alleys and vacant lots. Henry Webb lived in a small house right behind his blacksmith shop on the edge of town. The forge was cold at this hour, but a trail of smoke was still rising from the chimney of his small home. A single light glowed in a window. Kate swung down from her horse, tied the reins, and walked up to the door. She knocked 3 times, real quick. A full minute passed before the door slowly creaked open. Henry Webb was standing in the doorway, a shotgun in one hand and a candle in the other. He was 70 years old. His arms were solid as iron from 50 years at the forge. He had white hair, a white beard, and eyes that had seen enough liars to spot an honest person from a mile away. "Kate Brennan." His voice was like gravel and full of surprise. "Lord Almighty, girl, what in the world are you doing out here at this hour?" "Henry, I need your help." Webb looked past Kate to Eli, who stood near the horses. "Who is he?" "His name is Eli. He is helping us. Can we please come inside before somebody sees us?" Webb jumped back right away. "Get in here before Mrs. Patterson peeks out her window and starts spreading stories." The inside of the house was simple and tidy. There was a table with 2 chairs and a bed off in the corner. It was the home of a man who lived on his own and did not need much. Kate set the jar on Webb's workbench and unwrapped the cloth around it. The glass shone in the candlelight. "What am I looking at?" Webb asked. So Kate laid it all out for him. She told him about Thomas's journal, the water samples, the proof of mercury poisoning, the hearing on Monday, and the state's plan to take Emma away from her. Webb picked up the jar and raised it to the candlelight. His hands were shaking, but it was not because of his age. It was because of something else, something that looked a whole lot like guilt. "Thomas," he mumbled, "you clever son of a gun." "Will you keep it safe for us?" Kate asked. Webb set the jar down and fell into his chair. He rubbed his face with his rough, calloused hands. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were full of tears. "I need to tell you something," he said. "It is something I should have told you 2 years ago." Kate stood there, not moving a muscle. "What is it?" Webb took a long, shaky breath. "After Thomas died, I went up to that mine. It was the middle of the night, just like it is right now. I had to see it for myself. I had to know if what Thomas had been saying was true." He stopped for a second, and his voice got real low. "I saw the runoff pipe. I saw where it was dumping into the creek. The water that was pouring out of it was gray, Kate. It was gray, and it smelled like metal and death." The color drained from Kate's face. "You saw it. You saw the poison, and you never said a single word to me." "Wade threatened me the very next day," Webb's voice broke. "He said he knew I had been up there. He told me that if I opened my mouth, he would foreclose on my shop. He said he would run me clean out of the territory. I'm 70 years old. This shop is all I have." His hands flew up to cover his face. I was a coward, Webb whispered. Thomas was already gone. I told myself that nothing could bring him back, but that is not why I kept my mouth shut. I stayed quiet because I was scared. Kate did not say a thing. A whirlwind of feelings passed over her face: anger, betrayal, and then a flicker of understanding. It was the look of a woman who had been fighting all by herself, only to learn her husband's best friend had seen the truth all along and did nothing. Eli took a step forward. "You are telling us now." Webb looked up. "Because this man showed up," he said, pointing a finger right at Eli. "A stranger with nothing to lose and no reason to lie. That is what it took, Kate. That is what it took to shake an old coward like me out of his silence." "You are not a coward," Eli said. "You are scared. There is a difference. But Monday is coming. Kate needs folks who are willing to say out loud what everyone else has only been whispering." Webb sat up straighter in his chair. "What do you need me to do?" "Monday, at the hearing," Kate said, her voice steady even though tears were on her cheeks. "Stand up. Tell them what you saw at the mine. Tell them about Thomas. Wade will ruin me." "Wade is ruining you anyway," Eli said, leaning forward. "He is ruining this whole town. He is just doing it slow enough that nobody seems to notice. But if you stand up, maybe others will stand there with you." Webb looked down at the jar. The water inside seemed clean, like you could drink it. But they all knew the poison it held. They knew what it did to Thomas Brennan, and what it was now doing to little Emma. "I will be there come Monday," Webb finally said. "And may the good Lord forgive me for taking so long." Kate reached over and squeezed the old man's hand. "Thomas always said you were the finest man he ever knew." "Well, Thomas was wrong about that," Webb said, glancing over at Eli. "But maybe he wasn't wrong about this water. And maybe it is high time this whole town learned the truth." They rode back toward the ranch without a single word passing between them. The moon had climbed high across the night sky. It had to be past midnight. The world always feels different in these quiet hours, a little more true. It was like the truth itself had more room to stretch out and breathe when decent folk were all asleep. About halfway back to the house, Kate finally broke the silence. "You said you lost someone, your brother." Eli kept his horse moving alongside hers. He didn't say anything for a good long while. The moonlight threw their long shadows out across the trail. "Yeah," he said at last. "Will you tell me about him?" Eli rode on for what felt like an eternity without speaking. The horses fell into a steady matching rhythm. The night air was cool on their faces and carried the smell of mesquite and dry earth. "Tommy was 22, Eli began. I was 30. I'd been a deputy marshal down in Silver Creek, Colorado for about 6 years. Tommy, he followed me out there, wanted to be a lawman, just like his big brother." He took a pause. "There was a bank robbery. 4 men. I was clear on the other side of town when it all kicked off. Somebody came running to get me. I rode that horse harder than I ever have. I got there just 30 seconds after they shot him." Eli's voice was completely flat, with no feeling in it at all. It was measured. It was the voice of a man who had told this story to himself 1,000 times over. He was stretched out on the floor, his badge still pinned to his chest with blood pooled all around him. He looked right up at me and said, "Eli, I am sorry." He said it like he was the one who'd let me down, like he had somehow failed me. With his last breath, he told me he was sorry. Kate didn't offer him any comforting words. She didn't say she was sorry for his loss. She just kept riding beside him, close enough for him to know she was there, steady and sure. "I turned in my badge that very night," Eli continued. "I told myself I was through protecting people, done with the burden of lives I couldn't save. I spent the next 8 years just drifting, never settling down, never making a promise to anyone, and then Emma just had to go and catch your horse down in the creek." "Yes." A small, sad smile almost touched Eli's lips. "I reckon God's got a strange sense of humor." They finally made it back to the ranch. Emma was still fast asleep. Dusty the dog lifted his head when they came in, gave his tail one lazy thump against the floorboards, and went right back to sleep. Kate went to her daughter's room, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and placed a soft kiss on her forehead. She stood there in the doorway for a moment, just watching her little girl breathe. Eli waited for them out on the front porch, giving them their space, and stared up at the stars. They were so bright out here, so far from everything. There was nothing but the stars and the silence and the heavy feeling of what was coming. Kate stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her as quiet as a mouse. 2 days until Monday, she said. Just 2 days. Wade is going to throw everything he has at me, the law, this town, and any other weapon he can find. And you will have the proof that he poisoned your husband. A witness who saw the runoff from those mines and a former deputy marshal standing right beside you. In the moonlight, Kate looked him square in the eye. That is a whole lot more than I had yesterday. Yesterday, you did not have a prayer. Today, you have got a fighting chance. She held his stare. A quiet understanding seemed to pass between them. It was not trust. Not just yet, but it was the seed of it. It was the beginning of something that might grow into trust if they could just get through Monday alive. Do not go making promises you cannot keep, Kate said, her voice low. I am not promising we are gonna win. I am just promising that I will be standing there with you. That is all I can give you. Kate nodded, then turned to go back inside, but she paused at the door. Eli. Yes. Thank you for finding that journal, for helping me get the samples, for not turning tail and running when you had every reason in the world to. I am still here, am I not? You are. She took a deep breath. But there is a difference between staying and fighting. On Monday, when Wade rolls in with his lawyers and his threats and all his power, will you still be here then? Eli touched the old scar on his wrist. I was 30 seconds too late to save my brother. I am not going to be too late for your daughter. Kate's eyes began to fill with tears. She blinked them back hard. Good night, Eli. She slipped back inside the house. Eli stood alone on the porch. The night was at its blackest now, that hour just before the dawn when the dark feels heaviest and all your doubts start to holler. He thought about Tommy, about getting there too late, about the floor of that bank, about being just 30 seconds too late to change anything at all. He thought about Emma, about the tremble in her little hands, about that poison creeping through her veins, and about Monday bearing down on them, ready or not. He thought about Kate, a woman who had been fighting this fight all by herself for 2 long years, a woman folks called crazy for telling the truth, and who was about to walk into a courtroom to face the man who killed her husband and was now trying to take her child. Eli went on out to the barn, found a spot in the hay, and just laid there staring up at the rafters. His mind just would not shut down. Sometime around 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleeping, sat up and decided he might as well check on the horses just to make sure things were secure. The barn was quiet and still. His horse and Kate's mare were standing peacefully in their stalls, safe and sound. Eli walked the whole length of the barn, checking the doors, the windows, the roof. Everything was as locked down as he could make it. He was just about to head back to his bed in the hay when he heard it. Hoofbeats. More than one horse, and they were coming in fast. Eli moved to the big barn door and peered out into the dark. The moon was starting to dip below the horizon. The first hint of dawn was just barely touching the eastern sky, but it was a long way from morning. It was still dark enough for trouble to hide in. 6 riders came galloping up the road to the ranch. A cold knot formed in Eli's stomach. He recognized the horse Deputy Carter always rode. He recognized Carter himself, leading the pack. The other 5 men were strangers, but they all had that same hard look about them. Hired guns, the kind of men Wade used to do his dirty work. Money. The riders reined in their horses about 50 yards out from the little cabin. A man named Carter dismounted, walked confidently to the fence, and stopped. His voice cut through the quiet of the early morning. Mrs. Brennan, I know you are in there. You might as well come on out." A soft light began to glow in the cabin window. He could just make out the shape of Kate inside. Eli had already moved, silent as a shadow, slipping in through the back. He found Kate right by the front window, holding a rifle, her face looking pale in the dim light. "6 of them," she said in a hushed tone. "It is Carter and 5 others." "I know," he answered. Emma came into the room then, hair all wild from sleep and her eyes wide with fright. "Mama, what is happening?" Kate gave the rifle to Eli and knelt down to look her daughter in the eye. "Honey, I need you to go down into the root cellar. Take Dusty with you, and you stay there until I come get you. Mama, please do not make me." "Emma, you listen to me and you do it right now." Emma's little chin started to tremble, but she obeyed. She pulled up the trapdoor set in the kitchen floor and went down the ladder, with Dusty the dog right on her heels. Kate closed the door over them and slid a heavy rug on top of it. She took the rifle back from Eli. Her hands were perfectly steady now. All her fear had cooked down into something else, something much harder and a whole lot more dangerous. "Mrs. Brennan," Carter shouted again, "this is the last time I'm going to ask nicely. Come out peacefully." Kate moved to the front door, pulled it wide open, and stepped onto the porch, holding that rifle straight across her chest. "What do you want, Carter?" "Judge Wade sent us. He figured you might be needing a little assistance out here. He said you have got something that is not yours. Some old papers, maybe some glass jars with samples in them. He just wants us to collect those things, for safekeeping." A coldness washed over Kate's face. "I do not have the slightest idea what you are talking about. Now, Mrs. Brennan, let us not play these silly games." Carter's smile was thin and mean. "We can settle this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. The choice is all yours." Eli came out onto the porch then, taking his place right beside Kate. Carter's smile disappeared completely. "Well now, Drifter, I sure did not expect to see you up and about this early. I did not expect you would be out here threatening a woman and her child before breakfast. But I guess that is where we find ourselves." Carter's hand moved down toward the pistol on his hip. He did not draw it, just let his fingers rest on the handle. It was a threat, plain and simple. "This is not your trouble, stranger. You should just turn around and walk away. Live to see the sunset tonight. I am afraid I cannot do that." "And what is the reason for that?" Eli's voice was low and steady. "Because I gave my word, and I'm getting awfully tired of breaking my promises." The 5 men with Carter began to spread out, forming a line. Every single one of them had a hand on his gun. The message was as clear as a cloudless sky. It was 6 men against 2. And Kate was not a gunfighter. She was just a woman who knew how to use a rifle to defend her home. The odds were long. The situation was worse. And Monday, when the circuit judge would arrive, was still 2 full days away. But Eli was no stranger to bad situations, and he had faced down tougher odds than this. The thing that was different this time was that he was not alone. This time he had something that was truly worth fighting for. He had let Tommy down. He would not let Emma and Kate down, not now, not ever. The air was cold before the dawn. Eli could see the white puff of his own breath. He could see Kate's right there next to him. And he could see the breath of 6 men on horseback 50 yards away, their hands on their weapons, just waiting for the command to do what they came to do. Carter took a single step forward. "I am going to ask you one final time, real nice and polite. Just hand over whatever Thomas Brennan left with you, any of his papers, any of his samples, anything at all that might give Judge Wade some grief down the road." "And what if I say no?" Kate's voice did not waver one bit. "Then I suppose we will have to search the property. Tear this whole place apart, board by board, if we have to. Judge Wade gave us the authority. You call that legal authority? Is it legal to try and break into a woman's home in the dark? To scare a widow and her little girl?" The knuckles on Kate's hands turned white as she gripped the rifle. "That is not the law. That is just being a bully with a gun." Carter's smile was cold as a snake. "You can call it anything you like, ma'am. It is all going to end the same way. You have got something that Wade wants, and we are here to take it." Eli moved forward a step, putting himself squarely between Kate and the horseman. His hand was resting on his gun belt. He was not making a move, he was just making it clear he was ready. "You are going to have to come through me first." Carter just laughed. "You are only one man, Drifter. There are 6 of us here. Are you really fixing to die for folks you have only known for 3 days? I have died for a whole lot less." The words just hung there in that chilly air, and they carried the weight of truth. "Wait a minute." Carter's smile finally faded. He was a man who was used to people backing down. He counted on fear to do most of his work for him. But there was not a trace of fear on Eli's face, only a kind of quiet resolve. It was the look of a man who had made his peace with his own mortality a long, long time ago. "Who in the world are you, really?" Carter asked. "My name is Elijah Cross. I used to be a deputy United States Marshal out of Silver Creek, Colorado. I know the law, Carter, and I know the difference between enforcing it and just plain armed robbery. What you're doing right now, this is the second one." Carter's face went hard. "A marshal's badge does not mean anything out here. That might be true, but it does mean I know how to shoot. It means every bullet I fire finds its target. It means if you boys ride up onto this porch, at least 3 of you are not riding away." One of the men behind Carter shifted uneasily in his saddle. Eli could spot the difference between real hired guns and the men just following orders. The nervous ones, they would be the first to lose their nerve. "Mrs. Brennan," Carter's voice was like iron now, "this is your absolute last chance. Hand over what Wade wants, or we are coming in to get it." Kate raised the rifle, aiming it right at Carter's heart. Her hands were as steady as stone. The fear was all gone, burned away by a simmering rage that had been building for 2 years. "You want to tear my home apart?" Kate's voice was as sharp as a shard of glass. "You want to scare my little girl? You want to finish the job that your boss started when he poisoned my husband?" She worked the rifle's action, loading a round into the chamber with a loud click. "Go ahead and try." Carter's face turned a dark shade of red. "You are pointing a firearm at a deputy of the law, and you are threatening a mother protecting her child. I suppose that makes us about even." Eli's hand moved to his Colt pistol, slow and deliberate. He drew the firearm, holding it loosely at his side. 6 bullets, 6 men. The odds were terrible, but they were not impossible. "This is how this is going to go," Eli said in a low voice. "You are going to turn those horses around. You are going to ride straight back to Judge Wade. And you are going to tell him that Monday is coming, and we will settle this in a proper courtroom. Or you can try to push your way past me and Mrs. Brennan. But I can promise you this: some of you are going to die right here on this ground. It might be all of you. It might be me. But some of you will fall, and we will still be standing here." A deep, heavy quiet settled over the yard. It was the kind of silence you get right before a thunderstorm breaks wide open. Finally, one of the hired men spoke up. He was a young fella, maybe 25, and he sounded scared. "Carter, this is not what we signed up for. We were supposed to put a scare into them, not get into a real gunfight." "You keep your mouth shut," Carter snapped. "No." The young man began to slowly back his horse away from the group. "I am not getting myself killed because Judge Wade is greedy for some land. I have a wife, I have a baby coming. This whole situation is just plain wrong. You ride out now and you do not get your pay. I would rather be broke and breathing than rich and in a pine box." The young man turned his horse all the way around, dug in his spurs, and disappeared into the gray light of the morning. That left 5 men. Carter was starting to sweat now, even though the air was cool. His whole plan was falling apart at the seams. Judge Wade had sent him with 6 men to intimidate a widow. Now he was facing down a former lawman while his own men started to desert him. His backup had just turned tail. "Fine," Carter snarled. 4 is more than enough." But his voice had a little shake in it. It was just enough for Eli to hear. "Stand down, Carter," Eli said calmly. "This is not going to end well for you. I have got my orders. Those orders are fixing to get you 6 feet under." Carter went for his pistol fast as a snake, even faster than Eli figured he would be. But Eli was already moving. It was years of training, pure reflex taken over. He brought his Colt up and fired. The sound of the gunshot cracked open the silence of the valley. Birds exploded out of the trees. The horses shied and whinnied. Carter's pistol went spinning out of his hand. Blood blossomed on his fingers. Eli had shot the gun clean out of his grip without so much as breaking the skin. It was a warning shot. It was a show of pure skill. Carter stared at his bleeding hand, then looked at Eli, then at his own pistol laying 10 feet away in the dirt. "The next one goes in your chest," Eli said, his voice as calm as a frozen pond. "Your call." The last 3 men looked at each other, then at Carter, then back at Eli, who held that smoking pistol like it had grown right out of his arm. "We are getting out of here," one of them mumbled. He did not wait for an answer. He just wheeled his horse around and galloped off. The other 2 were right on his heels. Carter was all by himself now, on foot without a weapon, his hand dripping blood. His pride was shattered all to pieces. "Tell Wade," Kate called out from the porch. "Tell him we are not afraid of him anymore. Tell him Monday is coming, and we will be ready. Tell him Thomas left us everything we need to see him buried." Carter's face twisted up with pure rage. "You have no idea what you're getting yourselves into. You do not know who you're dealing with. Wade runs this whole territory. He is the law. He owns every bit of it." "He does not own us," Kate shouted back. "Not anymore." Carter hobbled over to his horse, pulled himself up with his good hand, and shot them one last hateful look. "On Monday," he promised, "Wade will tear you to shreds in that courtroom. And when he is through, there will not be a place in this territory safe enough for you to hide." Then he rode off. The sun finally started to peek over the mountains. That first light was golden and clean, washing away the ugliness of the last few minutes into the quiet of a new morning. Eli finally lowered his pistol. His hand had started to shake, the rush finally wearing off. He had been in gunfights before, had faced down criminals, outlaws, and men who wanted him dead. But this was different. This felt personal. Kate lowered her rifle. Her hands were trembling too. She sank down onto the top step of the porch. The strength that had held her up just seemed to evaporate. "I almost shot him," she whispered. "My finger was right there on the trigger. I came that close to killing a man." Eli sat down on the step next to her. "But you did not. That is the only part that matters. I wanted to, though. That is what scares me. For just a second, I truly wanted to pull that trigger and watch him fall. That is just being human. That is what happens when you are scared and mad and fighting for your child." Eli holstered his gun. "You did good, Kate. You stood your ground. You did not back down 1 inch." Kate looked over at him, her eyes shining. "This is just plain crazy. We are about to go to war with the most powerful man in the county over a few jars of water and a dead man's journal. We might lose everything. That is possible. Or it is possible we could win." Eli's voice was gentle. "No matter what happens, you are not in this alone anymore." The trapdoor in the kitchen floor lifted up. Emma's face, pale and streaked with dust, appeared next to her dog. "Mama, is it over?" Kate quickly wiped her eyes, got to her feet, and rushed to her daughter, helping her out of the cellar and pulling her into a tight hug. "It is over, sweetie, for now. I heard a gunshot. Mr. Eli ran them off. They are all gone." Emma looked over at Eli. Her brown eyes looked way too old for a 9-year-old girl, way too knowing. "Are they going to come back?" Eli thought about telling her a sweet lie, but Emma deserved the truth. "They might," he said. "But if they do, we are going to be ready for them." Emma just nodded like that was the answer she was expecting. As if she had already learned at 9 years old that the world does not give you easy answers or safe promises. Kate started a pot of coffee. Nobody spoke about what had just happened. They went about their morning chores like the standoff never took place. Like 6 men had not just tried to strong-arm them into giving up, but the rifle stayed loaded on the kitchen table. Eli never took off his gun belt, and Kate kept glancing out the window as if she expected Carter and his men to come riding back any second. After they ate, Emma went outside with Dusty. She needed some fresh air. She needed to pretend that things were normal even when they were anything but. Kate and Eli stayed at the table. "Today is Sunday," Kate said. "Tomorrow is Monday. We have one more day until Wade tries to take Emma. We have the water samples. We have Webb ready to testify. We have Thomas's journal. It is not going to be enough." Kate's voice was flat. You saw the look on Carter's face. Wade knows we have something. He's just going to come at us even harder now. He will have his lawyers. He will use his money. He will bring all of his power down on top of us. Then we will bring ours. Kate let out a harsh laugh. What power do we have? I am a widow with a failing ranch. You are a drifter. Webb is a 70-year-old blacksmith. What kind of power is that? We have the truth. The truth is not what saved Thomas. No, but Thomas made sure the truth could save Emma. That is what these samples are for. That is what his journal is for. He died to make sure we would have weapons to fight back with. Kate's eyes filled with tears again. She was crying more now than she had in the last 2 years. It was like something deep inside her had finally cracked open. Like the wall she had built around herself just to survive was finally coming down. "I'm just so tired," she whispered. 2 years of fighting all alone. 2 years of everybody in town saying I was crazy. 2 years of watching my daughter get sicker and sicker and not being able to do a single thing about it. I am just so very tired, Eli. Eli reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling. "Then let me help you carry it," he said. "Just for a little while, at least until Monday. You do not have to be strong all by yourself anymore." Kate looked down at their hands together, hers small and calloused, his much larger, the scar across his wrist easy to see. Two broken people just trying to hold on. "Why are you really here?" she asked. The real reason, not some story about your brother. Why are you willing to risk your own hide for us?" Eli was quiet for a good long while. Through the window he could see Emma playing with Dusty, throwing a stick for the dog to fetch. It was the pure, simple joy of a little girl who had no notion that her entire world was about to be torn apart. "Because 3 days ago, I might as well have been a ghost," Eli finally said. "I was hollowed out inside, just walking through the days. It had been that way for 8 years. Then your little girl stood in that creek and just said, 'Please.' And it was like a switch flipped on inside me. Something I reckoned had died right alongside Tommy." He drew a deep breath. "A purpose. That is what came back. For 8 long years, my only purpose was to keep on running. I did not have a single reason to care about anything. But Emma, she gave me one. Y'all gave me one. And maybe, just maybe, if I can help save the 2 of you, it will somehow balance the scales for the fact that I could not save Tommy." "That is not how it works," Kate said softly. "Saving us is not going to bring your brother back. I know, but it might help me learn to live with myself again. It might let me get a night's sleep without seeing his face every single time I shut my eyes." Kate gave his hand a squeeze. "You are a good man, Elijah Cross. I am a broken man, just trying to patch things up before it is too late. Well, in that case, we are both of us broken. Maybe that is enough." They sat like that for some time, holding hands over the kitchen table. 2 people who had lost way too much, who had fought their battles all alone for far too long, and who had finally found someone else to stand with them. Then Kate pulled her hand back, got to her feet, and wiped her eyes. "We are going to need more help," she said. "Other folks, other families that Wade's mine has hurt. Who else lives downstream from it?" Kate paused to think. "There is the Henderson family. Their little boy had the shakes for over a year. Martha Webb, Henry's daughter. Her little girl has been sickly. Old man Patterson lost some of his cattle. And the Fletcher family's well water turned foul last spring. You reckon any of them will be willing to speak up?" "I just do not know. They're all scared to death, same as everyone else. Then we have to make them less scared. We need to show them they're not standing alone in this, that other folks are finally making a stand." Kate nodded. "We need to go see them today, before Monday comes. before Wade has a chance to scare them back into silence. "I will go," Eli offered. "You stay here with Emma. You keep her safe." "No," Kate's voice was solid as a rock. "We are going together, and Emma is coming right along with us. I am not about to leave her here by herself." Not after what happened this morning. Eli understood completely. After Carter showed up uninvited, Kate was never going to let Emma out of her sight. She could not afford that kind of risk. "Then we all go," he said. "We will face this thing as one." They rode into town around mid-morning. Emma sat in front of Kate on the mare, with Eli riding right beside them. Dusty trotted along next to the horses, his tongue hanging out, looking happy as could be despite it all. The town was still. It had that Sunday kind of stillness. The church bells had rung about an hour before. Most everyone was back home by now, having their Sunday dinner and resting up. Kate led them to a small house on the east side of town. The white paint was flaking off and the garden was choked with weeds. A child's little toy wagon sat abandoned in the yard. "The Hendersons," Kate said. "Their boy Tommy is 10 now. He had the tremors so bad last year he could not even make it to school. They got off their horses." Kate walked up and knocked on the door. A woman answered. She was 40 years old but looked like she had been worn down to nothing by worry. Her eyes got big when she saw Kate. "Mrs. Brennan, I was not expecting to see you." She looked nervously up and down the quiet street. "You should not be here, Mrs. Henderson. I need to speak with you about Tommy, about the water." Mrs. Henderson's expression closed up tight. "I cannot. My husband said not to get mixed up in it. Please, you need to go. Your boy is sick on account of Wade's mine. You know it." "I know you do. Knowing a thing and proving it are two mighty different things." Kate took out Thomas's journal and opened it for Mrs. Henderson to see the pages. She pointed out the detailed notes, the careful records of how the sickness was spreading downstream. "Thomas proved it," Kate said. "Right before he died, he gathered water samples. We have them. We can get them tested. We can show everybody what Wade has been doing." Mrs. Henderson's hand shook as she looked over the pages. Thomas always was a thorough man. "Will you help us?" "Monday at the courthouse. Will you stand up and tell what happened to Tommy?" Mrs. Henderson glanced back inside her house at a small boy sitting at the table. His hands were shaking just a little as he tried to lift his fork. Her son, her own flesh and blood. "If I testify, Wade will destroy us. My husband works for the mine. We will lose everything we have. If you do not testify, Tommy only gets sicker. That water just keeps on coming, and more children get poisoned." Kate's voice was gentle, but it was also firm. "I am not asking you to sacrifice your family. I am asking you to save them." Mrs. Henderson shut her eyes tight. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. "I will talk to my husband," she whispered. "I cannot promise you anything, but I will try." They paid a visit to 3 more families that afternoon. It was the same sad story at every house. There was fear, there was worry, and there was the desperate figuring of people caught between doing what is right and just trying to survive. By sundown, they had promises from 2 of the families. They were shaky promises, the kind with strings attached, the kind that could vanish into thin air come Monday when Wade started throwing his weight around. They were on their way back to the ranch when they first saw the smoke. It was a plume of black smoke rising up from the direction of the Brennan property. All the color drained right out of Kate's face. No, 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 no. They dug their heels into their horses and rode as hard as they could. Emma clung tight to her mother while Dusty ran flat out right beside them. When they came over the last hill, they saw it. The barn was on fire. Not the cabin, thank God, just the barn. Flames were leaping high into the darkening sky. The smoke was thick and oily black. Kate let out a cry and tried to ride straight for it. Eli reached out and grabbed her reins, pulling her to a stop. "Kate, no, the horses are out. Look there." The 2 horses were safe over in the pasture. Somebody had let them out before they set the blaze. This was not about hurting animals. This was a warning. Kate slid down from her horse and just stood there in the yard, staring at the burning barn. She watched 2 days of Eli's hard work go up in smoke. along with all of Thomas's tools and everything that had belonged to Emma's papa. They did this, she said, her voice hollow and dead. Wade's men came back and they did this. Emma burst into tears. Papa's workshop was in there, all of his tools. Eli swung down from his own horse and walked closer to check the burn pattern. It was done by a professional. Kerosene had been splashed in a few different spots at once. This was arson, set by someone who knew exactly what they were about. The barn was a complete loss. There was not a thing they could do to save it. All they could do was stand there and watch it burn itself out. Kate fell to her knees in the dirt, and Emma sank down right next to her. A mother and her daughter watching the fire chew up what was left of Thomas Brennan's life and work. Eli came and stood right behind them, putting a hand on Kate's shoulder. He did not say a word because there were no words left to say. This was Wade's answer. This is what you get when you decide to fight back. When you refuse to let them scare you off, they burn down your barn, they destroy your livelihood, and they turn your husband's memory to ash. The fire burned for 2 hours. By the time it finally settled down to a pile of glowing embers, the barn was nothing but a black skeleton of charred timber and twisted metal. The roof was gone. The walls had caved in. Everything that had been inside was turned to dust. Kate had not moved a muscle. She just knelt in the dirt, staring. Emma had cried herself out and now sat quietly, leaning her head against her mother. "The samples," Kate said suddenly. "Were they in the barn?" "No," Eli said. "One is buried out at Willow Creek, one is with Webb, and the last one—" He stopped talking. He had hidden Kate's sample right there in the barn, in the back stall, buried deep under a pile of hay. His face must have told her everything because Kate grabbed his arm. It was in there, was not it? The sample was in the barn. Eli did not have to say a word. His silence told her everything. Kate made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a laugh. It was the noise of pure fury tangled up with despair. They burned it. Wade burned our only proof. "We still have 2 more, Eli said, his words coming out in a hurry. "The one we buried out at Willow Creek, and the one we left with Webb. That is, unless Wade knows about those too. Unless this was only the start of it all." Emma looked up, her little face a mess of tears and black soot. "We have to go to Willow Creek," she said. "We have to make sure Papa's sample is still there." Kate gave a sharp nod, pulling herself to her feet and then helping Emma up. They were both caked in dirt and ash, but their eyes had gone hard as stone. The tears were all gone. Something else had moved in to take their place. Pure, unbridled rage. They rode for Willow Creek in the pitch dark, letting the moonlight show them the way once more. The trail felt like an old friend now. They had been up and down it so many times in the last 3 days, they knew every last twist and turn by heart. The little fishing spot looked quiet and undisturbed. The big rock was there, and the willow tree, right in the place where Thomas and Emma used to spend their Saturday mornings. Eli got down on his knees and started digging right where they had buried the 3rd sample. His fingers brushed against wood. The box was still there, wrapped up good and tight in oilcloth, completely sealed. He lifted it from the earth and carefully unwrapped it. The jar was in one piece, the water inside was perfectly clear, and the label was easy to read. You could not mistake Thomas's handwriting. Kate took it from his hands, holding it like it was the most valuable thing on God's green earth. "One left. We have 1 sample left. 2, Eli corrected her gently. "Webb still has 1, too. If Wade has not already paid him a little visit." They spurred their horses toward town, making a straight line for Webb's smithy. Kate pounded on the door with her fist. Webb yanked it open, holding a shotgun, but when he saw who it was, he lowered the barrel. "Good Lord Almighty, what in heaven's name happened to you two?" "Wade burned down my barn," Kate said, her voice stretched tight as a wire. "Is the sample all right?" The warmth left Webb's face, leaving it grim. He vanished back inside and came out a moment later holding the jar. "It is safe and sound. It is hidden Webb told them. Tucked away behind a false wall in my workshop. Wade's boys could tear this place apart board by board, and they would never lay a finger on it. Kate felt like she might just collapse from pure relief. 2 samples? We still have 2 samples left. Webb looked at the soot staining their clothes, at the tear tracks dried on Emma's face, and the deep, weary ache in Kate's eyes. "This is a war now," Webb said, his voice low and serious. "You understand that, do you not? Wade has declared war. He is done following any kind of rules." "Then so are we," Kate said, and her voice was like cold steel. "Monday, at the courthouse, we bring everything we have. The journal, the water samples, every last witness we can find, and we are going to make Wade answer for what he did." Webb gave a single firm nod. "I will be there, and I know a few other folks who will be too." "Who?" "Doc Pierce came by to see me this afternoon. He told me he cannot keep his mouth shut one day longer. He said he is ready to stand up and testify about what really happened to Thomas." Webb took a breath. "And there is something else. Doc Pierce told me he did something 3 days ago, right after you came to my place that first night." Kate leaned in closer. "What did he do?" "He wrote a letter to the United States Marshal's office down in Austin. He sent them copies of Thomas's real medical papers, his blood work, all of it. He told Webb he just could not carry around that guilt for another day. He figured that even if he got scared and backed out of testifying, the truth would at least get to somebody who could do something about it." Eli felt a tight knot form in the pit of his stomach. "Did he say if the marshal ever sent a letter back?" "He has no idea. He just put it in the mail 3 days ago. You know, the federal mail does not rush for anybody." Webb looked at both of them, his gaze steady and clear. "But if that letter lands on the right desk, if a United States Marshal decides to ride into town on Monday, then Wade is caught in his own trap," Kate said, finishing his thought. Webb gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Then Wade is good and trapped." Webb took another breath. "He also mentioned he sent that letter 3 days back to the United States Marshal's office up in Cheyenne." Kate's eyes flew wide open. "He did what?" "He sent copies of every single thing. Thomas's actual medical files, the proof of mercury poisoning, the names of other families who had lost someone, and he asked for a complete federal investigation." Eli felt something break loose deep inside his chest. Did the marshal send a reply? "We do not know for sure yet, but if he did, if a federal lawman shows his face come Monday, Wade cannot just brush this aside. He cannot buy his way out of this one with threats or money." Kate lifted a hand to her mouth in shock. Doc Pierce really did that. After 2 whole years of saying nothing, he sent all that proof to the federal government. He said he could not stand to look at himself in the mirror anymore. He said watching you fight this all by your lonesome shamed him into finally doing the right thing. Kate started crying again. But these were a whole different kind of tears. They were not tears of hopelessness. It was relief, all mixed up with pure disbelief. "We might just have a real fighting chance at this," she whispered. "We might actually win this thing." "Do not start the party just yet," Webb warned her. "Wade has got the kind of money and friends in high places we can only imagine. He has got lawyers and judges and powerful men tucked right in his pocket. But yes, ma'am, we have got ourselves a chance." They rode back to their homestead underneath a sky full of stars. The skeleton of the burned-out barn stood like a black ghost against the night, a harsh reminder of everything they had lost and everything they were still risking. But now they had 2 water samples. They had Webb's promise. They had Doc Pierce's newfound courage. They had the whisper of a federal marshal maybe on his way. And they had each other. Kate gently tucked Emma into her bed in their little cabin. The girl was plumb worn out and fell fast asleep the moment her head touched the pillow, with Dusty curling up right beside her. Kate stepped back out onto the porch and saw Eli sitting on the steps, staring at the ruined barn. "I am so sorry," Eli said, his voice quiet. "That sample was my responsibility. I should have found a better place for it. You had no way of knowing they would burn the whole barn to the ground. I should have expected it. Kate sat down right next to him, close enough for their shoulders to touch. "Stop it," she said. "Stop carrying the weight of every single thing that goes wrong. Stop taking the blame for things you had no power to change. I could have changed this." "No, you could not have." Kate's voice was as solid as an oak tree. "Wade did this, not you. Wade is the one who set fire to my barn. Wade is the one who poisoned my husband. Wade's company is trying to take my daughter from me. This is all on him." Eli looked over at her, at this woman who had lost almost everything, who had been in this fight alone for 2 long years, who by all rights should have been broken but was not, and yet she was not. "You have a resilience in you that I just do not have," he told her. "No, I am just backed into a corner." When you are fighting for your child, being cornered can sure look like resilience. They sat in the silence that followed. The night air was turning sharp and cold, and the stars overhead were scattered like diamonds. Far off in the hills, a lone coyote cried out. "Tomorrow is Sunday," Kate said, her voice barely a whisper. "And then Monday, we face the court. This whole ordeal comes to an end one way or the other." "Yep. Are you afraid?" "I'm scared to death." Kate offered a small, tired smile. "Good. So am I." She rested her head on his shoulder. Eli went completely still. He did not breathe, did not move a muscle. He was afraid to shatter the fragile peace of the moment. "Thank you," Kate whispered, "for staying, for taking on this fight with me, for simply being here when I felt like the last person on earth. I am here because it is exactly where I am supposed to be." "But why?" Eli considered all the possible answers he could give. He could bring up Tommy, or the need to set things right, or the 8 long years he had wasted running from his own past. In the end, though, the real reason was much simpler. "Because when I am with you, I stop being a ghost." He said, "I feel real. For the first time in 8 years, I actually feel like I am living." Kate lifted her head and looked straight into his eyes. The pale moonlight softened her features, taking down the walls she had built so high. For this one moment, they were gone. Just for him. Eli. "Yeah. If we get through Monday, if we somehow manage to win this thing, what comes next? What would you want to happen?" Kate was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I want you to stay. Not for 3 more days. Not just to see the harvest through. I want you to plant your roots here. For good." Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. "Kate, I know it sounds foolish. I know we have barely had any time to know one another. But somewhere in the last 3 days, you became a part of this ranch, a part of our lives. And the idea of you just riding away after Monday, the idea of having to stand up to all of this on my own again," her voice broke. "I cannot do it, Eli. I cannot go back to that kind of loneliness." Eli reached over and wrapped his hand around hers, holding it firmly. "I am not going anywhere," he said, his voice solid and sure. "On Monday we face Wade. We might win and we might lose, but we are going to do it together. And when the dust from all this settles, I will still be standing right here." "I am staying." Tears welled up in Kate's eyes. "You promise?" "I promise." She leaned forward and kissed him, a quick, gentle touch, then pulled back, her expression a mix of terror and bravery. Eli tenderly brushed her cheek with his thumb, then kissed her back, taking his time. He poured everything he was feeling into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, Kate was smiling through her tears. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." They sat on that porch until the first hint of morning light, not talking much, just being together. 2 people who had been broken by life and had somehow found each other in the debris. 2 people who figured out that facing the world together was a whole lot better than facing it alone. The next day was Sunday, a day of quiet before the storm. Monday would be the day of reckoning, and whatever it brought, they would meet it standing shoulder to shoulder. Monday dawned bright and cold. The sky was a vast cloudless blue above the mountains, which did nothing to lift the heavy weight of what was coming. Eli had been awake for hours. He had cleaned his pistol, inspected every bullet, and put on his only clean shirt. This was not a legal matter. It was a war dressed up in courthouse clothes. He had to look ready. Kate got Emma into her Sunday dress. It was a small white dress with clean shoes, and her hair was brushed smooth and tied with a ribbon. Emma looked like she was on her way to a church social, not a courthouse where a judge would decide if she could continue to live with her own mother. They had breakfast in silence. No one had an appetite, but Kate insisted they all eat something. "You will need your strength," she said. "No matter what today holds, you are going to need to be strong." The trip into town felt like it went on for an eternity. Each minute stretched into an hour. The sound of the horses' hooves on the dirt road was like a slow, steady drumbeat counting them down. The courthouse was a two-story building of stone and wood right in the heart of town, with a flag hanging motionless in the still air. The street in front was filled with people. It seemed like half the county had come. A few were there to support Kate, but the majority were there to watch the drama unfold, to see what happened when a single widow dared to challenge the most powerful man in the territory. Eli helped Kate from the horse, and Emma stood close between them. Dusty, the dog, stayed with the horses, letting out a soft whine as they walked away. As they approached the courthouse steps, Eli spotted Henry Webb near the entrance. The old blacksmith wore his Sunday coat and held his hat in his hands. Beside him stood Doc Pierce, clutching his medical bag to his chest. Both men appeared nervous, but their faces were set with firm resolve. Webb gave Kate a small nod. She returned it. They had shown up. Both of her witnesses were present, prepared to speak the truth. Inside, the courtroom was already stuffy and warm despite the cold morning. It was packed with too many bodies and too much anxious energy. Every bench was taken. People lined the back walls, and the air was heavy with the scent of nervous sweat. Judge Cornelius Wade was perched high behind the bench. He was a man of about 60, with silver hair and formal black robes, the very image of absolute authority. But Eli thought he detected a small flicker in the judge's eyes, something that looked suspiciously like unease. Good, Eli thought. He ought to be uneasy. Deputy Carter was leaning against the far wall. A clean bandage wrapped around the hand Eli had shot the pistol out of. Carter's glare was a clear promise of future trouble. Payback after the official business was done. Wade's lawyer stood by the bench. He was a young man in a costly suit, armed with a thick stack of papers and a look of pure confidence. Kate sat at the table for the defendant. Eli sat directly behind her, with Emma between them, her tiny hand gripping her mother's. Wade struck his gavel. "This hearing is now in session. The matter at hand is the welfare of the child, Emma Brennan. This court has received a petition questioning the fitness of her mother and sole guardian, Mrs. Kate Brennan. Mrs. Brennan, do you have legal counsel to speak on your behalf?" Kate rose to her feet. "I am representing myself, Your Honor." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. A faint, condescending smile appeared on Wade's face. A woman trying to act as her own lawyer against his expensive one. He thought this would be over quickly. "Very well," Wade said. "Mr. Harrison, you may begin." The lawyer stood up, cleared his throat, and began to read from his documents. "Your Honor, the petitioner has evidence that Mrs. Brennan's homestead is in a state of serious neglect. The ranch is failing. The child has been seen running around without shoes, inadequately dressed, and frequently without supervision. Furthermore, Mrs. Brennan is housing an unknown male drifter, creating a morally questionable environment entirely unfit for a young child." The murmuring in the courtroom grew louder. People started craning their necks to stare at Eli. "We ask," the lawyer continued, "that the court name a temporary guardian for the child, while a complete investigation is conducted into Mrs. Brennan's ability to be a proper parent." Wade nodded with a somber look. "These are very grave accusations. Mrs. Brennan, what is your response to these charges?" Kate stood up straight. Her hands were trembling badly, but her voice came out as solid as granite. Your Honor, my ranch is not failing. It is being intentionally destroyed. Just 2 nights ago, my barn was deliberately burned down. And on Saturday morning, 6 men with your own Deputy Carter at their head came to my property before dawn, threatening both me and my daughter. The courtroom erupted in noise. Wade hammered his gavel over and over. Mrs. Brennan, those are incredibly serious claims to make without any evidence. I have evidence. Kate brought out Thomas's journal. This was my husband's journal. It has daily entries detailing the water contamination from the Wade Mining Company. It has proof that the mercury in our well water is what poisoned him. And it has proof that his death certificate was a complete lie. She set the journal down firmly on the judge's bench. The color drained from Wade's face. And there is more, Kate said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I have water samples that my husband took just before he passed away. They are sealed, they are labeled, and they are ready to be tested by an independent party. Wade leaned forward. Mrs. Brennan, this hearing is about a custody issue, not about my mining company. Operations. These 2 things are connected, Your Honor. You filed this petition for my little girl just 3 days after I told you no on your last offer for my land. The very same piece of ground that sits right on top of the richest vein in Wade Mining's entire claim. This was never about my daughter's welfare. This is about you getting your hands on my property. The courtroom fell silent. It was so quiet you could have heard a feather fall, and every single person was looking at Judge Wade. The judge's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. That is a terrible accusation. Eli stood up. Then prove her wrong, Your Honor. Open your books. Show this town you do not have a single dime tied up in the Wade Mining Company. Show everyone you are a fair man looking after a child, not some land baron trying to bully a widow out of his way. Judge Wade stared daggers at Eli, his eyes full of pure contempt. And just who in the world are you to speak in this courtroom? My name is Elijah Cross, Your Honor. I served as a deputy marshal out of Silver Creek, Colorado. For the last week, I have been keeping an eye on Ms. Brennan's place. It is a clean home with a healthy child and a mother who works 18 hours a day to provide for her daughter, all while this court has been making her life miserable. Eli set Thomas's journal on the table right in front of the judge. I have also read through Thomas Brennan's personal diary. He took careful daily notes on the bad water, including dates, measurements, and how the sickness was affecting his cattle and the people living downstream from Wade Mining. These notes are a record of the poisoning that directly caused Thomas Brennan's death. Judge Wade would not even put a finger on the journal. He just stared at it like it was a rattler ready to strike. Mr. Cross, you are not qualified to judge water quality or what causes a man to die. No, sir, I am not. But a federal inspector is, and a licensed doctor most certainly is, a voice called out from the back of the courtroom. I can speak on that, Your Honor. Every head in the room swiveled around. Standing there in the doorway was Doc Samuel Pierce. He was 70 years old, dressed in his white coat and carrying his doctor's bag. His hands trembled a little, but his eyes were steady and clear. He walked up the aisle with the slow, sure-footed pace of a man who had finally decided he could not outrun his own conscience. My name is Dr. Samuel Pierce. I have been the doctor in this town for 42 years. 2 years ago, I was the one who signed Thomas Brennan's death certificate. Wade cut in, his words coming out in a rush. Dr. Pierce, this is not the proper time for testimony. Then make it the time. Pierce looked Wade square in the eye. Because I lied on that certificate. You told me to write that he died from a fever nobody could explain, or you would see to it that I lost my medical license. But Thomas Brennan did not die from any fever. The whole courtroom seemed to suck in its breath at once. Thomas Brennan died of slow mercury poisoning, Pierce said. Every word landed with a heavy thud. I knew it then. I have known it for 2 long years, and I have carried that heavy guilt every single day since. He opened his medical bag and took out a folder. These are Thomas's true medical files. The blood work, the notes on his decline, everything that pointed to mercury, which lines up perfectly with drinking poisoned water. I made copies of every last page because I knew deep down that one day the truth would have to come out. He placed the folder on Judge Wade's bench right beside the journal. Wade just glared at the evidence piling up against him, his calm composure finally beginning to break apart. "Dr. Pierce, you are clearly not in your right mind. You are just trying to get attention with this little show. Then you had better explain these." Henry Webb got up from his seat among the spectators. He was 70 years old with the powerful arms of a blacksmith and a voice that sounded like ringing steel. "I saw the drainage pipe coming out of Wade Mining 2 weeks after Thomas died. I went up there myself in the middle of the night. The water pouring out of it was gray and it had a foul metallic smell. I saw it plain as day." Judge Wade's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this has become a complete circus. We insist that you get this proceeding under control." But Wade was not listening. He was staring at the doorway, where United States Marshal James Coulter had just stepped inside. He was a man of 50, with a federal star pinned to his coat, the trail dust still on his boots, and eyes that had seen too much crooked dealing to be bothered by some small-town judge. The marshal walked to the front of the courtroom, his steps slow and deliberate. "Judge Wade," Coulter said, "I am United States Marshal Coulter, from the Territorial Office. 3 days ago, I received a letter about contaminated water and a falsified death record right here in your jurisdiction. I have spent the last 72 hours looking into the Wade Mining Company." Judge Wade's face went from red to a sickly gray. "Marshal, this is a local issue. It was a local issue. Now it is a federal matter. This is environmental poisoning that crosses county lines and affects multiple families. That puts it right in my territory." Coulter turned to face the packed courtroom. "I have tested water samples from 3 separate locations. The well water on the Brennan Ranch has mercury levels at 400 parts per million. The creek downstream from Wade Mining shows a similar amount of poison. Both of those readings are 40 times higher than what the federal government considers safe." He turned back to Wade. "I have also reviewed the medical files for 6 families who live downstream from that mine. Every one of them is suffering from symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning, and all of them are getting their drinking water from wells that draw from that poisoned creek." The courtroom erupted. Folks started shouting, some angry, others just relieved to finally hear the truth. Judge Wade's gavel was useless against the wave of noise. Marshal Coulter just raised one hand, and the room fell silent. "Judge Wade," Coulter said, "I am putting the Wade Mining Company under a federal investigation. All work is to stop immediately until a full environmental study is done. I am also recommending that the territorial governor look into your actions on this bench." Wade stood up, trembling with a powerless rage. "You have no right to shut down my family's business. Your family's business poisons citizens of the United States. That gives me all the right I need." Wade glanced around the courtroom, at the faces of the people who had feared him just yesterday. He saw the folks who had stayed quiet because he controlled their jobs, and he saw a town that was finally seeing him for the greedy man he was. He looked at Kate, at the widow he had tried to break, the woman who fought him by herself for 2 long years, the mother who would not be run off even after he torched her barn and went after her child. Kate looked straight back at him, not a trace of fear in her eyes. Judge Wade's shoulders slumped. All the fight seemed to pour right out of him. "The custody petition is dismissed," he mumbled, "without prejudice." Kate's knees buckled. Eli was right there to catch her and hold her up. Emma wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. "Mama, did we win?" Kate knelt down, hugging her daughter so tight that Emma let out a small squeak. "Yes, baby," Kate whispered. "We won. We finally won." The courtroom erupted again, but this time it was a joyful noise. People surged forward to shake Kate's hand, to give her a hug, to say they were sorry for being silent for 2 years. Henry Webb had tears running down his face. Doc Pierce was crying too. Even Marshal Coulter had the hint of a smile. Eli stood back from the crowd, just watching Kate and Emma get all the support they should have had all along. He watched a town remember how to stand together. Judge Wade slipped out through a side door. He did not look at anyone. Deputy Carter followed right behind him. They were both ruined men. Marshal Coulter came over to Eli. "You are Cross, the former deputy marshal." "Yes, sir. Good work you did here. Bringing me into this mess, though, I have to ask, how did you know about the water samples before Dr. Pierce's letter even reached me?" Eli took a quiet breath. "I did not. A single letter. That whole performance in the courtroom was a pure bluff. I told them I had reached out to the marshal's office, just praying it would spook Wade into a foolish move. Coulter just threw his head back and laughed. Well, it sure as heck did the trick. And when you add in Pierce's real letter, it was even better. Sometimes the law just needs a little nudge from both ends to get things right." He offered Eli his hand. "If you ever feel the pull to put on a badge again, you come see me. This land could use more decent men like you. My days of wearing a badge are over, sir, but I appreciate the offer." He found Kate in the sea of faces, with little Emma balanced on her hip. Tears were streaming down both their smiling faces. "We did it," Kate whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We really did it." "No, you were the one who did it. You kept this fight alive for 2 long years. I just happened to wander in at the finish line. You were here when it counted the most." Emma reached her arms out for Eli. He took the child from Kate, and she wrapped her little arms tight around his neck. "Thank you for helping my mama," she breathed right into his ear. "Thank you for staying with us." A knot formed deep in Eli's throat. He held the 9-year-old girl who had grabbed his horse down by the creek just 4 days ago, changing the entire direction of his life. "I am not going anywhere," he promised her. "I gave you my word. You remember?" "I remember." They stepped out of that courthouse into the brilliant light of morning. The street was buzzing with people celebrating Kate's win, celebrating Wade's downfall, celebrating the simple truth finally standing up to power. But Eli only saw 2 people in that whole crowd. Kate and Emma were his family now, the reason he would stay, the meaning he had been searching for all these last 8 years. They rode for home together, right on past the charred timbers of the old barn, past the broken fence line, past all the scars that Wade had left on the land. But somehow, none of that seemed to hold any power anymore. They had won, against every single odd, against all the influence Wade thought he had. They had won because they stood as one. And tomorrow was the first day of rebuilding, together. The spring of 1886 had arrived. The Brennan Ranch was a whole new place. A new barn stood tall, even grander than the one it replaced, built by the good men from town who all gave their time freely. The new fence ran straight and true. The garden was bursting with green, full of life. 2 healthy horses grazed in the pasture, their coats gleaming in the sun. Emma was getting better every day. Doc Pierce made the trip out to test her blood every single month, and the amount of mercury was steadily dropping. Just 1 more year with clean water and good meals, he had declared on his last visit. And she will be about as close to normal as we can get. The shaking in her hands might never leave completely, but she will live a long and happy life. Her hands did not tremble so much these days. She could write again, forming small, careful letters, and seeing her own name on the page looked right. She could hold a fork without trouble. She could fasten the buttons on her own dress, and she could play with Dusty until her fingers gave out. She was healing, piece by piece. She was out in the yard at that very moment with Dusty, showing him tricks. "Sit. That is a good boy. And now roll over." Dusty's tail thumped against the ground as he happily flopped over in the grass. Emma's laugh rang out, and it was the sound of pure happiness. Kate stood by the fence, just taking in the sight of her daughter. Eli came up beside her, putting his arm around her waist as she leaned her head against his shoulder. "She is getting stronger," Kate said softly, every model day from getting any harder. Just like her mother, a smile touched Kate's lips. "We are both standing a little straighter thanks to you. That strength was in y'all long before I ever came along. I only helped you find it again." They shared a comfortable silence. For 6 months they had been putting the pieces of this new life together. 6 months of letting old wounds scar over. 6 months of learning what it really meant to be a family. Kate finally looked over at him. Do you ever have any regrets about it? About settling down? About leaving that life on the road behind? Only every single day, Eli said with a completely serious face. Kate playfully pushed his arm. You are a terrible liar. Eli finally let a grin break through. He drew her a little closer. It was the best choice I ever made. It was the only choice that ever truly counted. Even though it means you are stuck with a widow, her sick little girl, and a ranch that is one bad storm from falling apart. That is exactly why I stayed. Just then, Emma came tearing over to them. Mama, Mr. Eli, Dusty knows a brand new trick. Do you want to come see? We would be delighted to, sweetheart. Emma proudly had Dusty perform his trick. The dog executed it without a flaw. Emma's face was just glowing with happiness. That is mighty impressive, Eli said. Your papa would be so very proud. Emma looked right up at him, her wide brown eyes suddenly looking grave. Mr. Eli, can I ask you a question that is real important? You can ask me anything at all. Would it be okay with you if I started calling you Papa? I know you are not my real Papa. My real Papa is in heaven now, but you are here with us, and you take care of me and Mama, and you show me how to do things. Her words faded away as if she lost her nerve. Eli felt his throat tighten. He cut a glance at Kate. Her eyes were shimmering with tears, but she gave a slow nod. He lowered himself to one knee, so he was eye to eye with Emma. Emma, nothing in this entire world would make me happier. Emma wrapped her small arms around his neck in a tight hug. Thank you, Papa. Eli held her tight. This was the little girl who had given him a reason to keep going. This was the child who had stood in a stream asking for a hand and ended up giving him a purpose when he had none. Kate knelt down beside them both. She circled her arms around them. The three of them stayed like that, a tight little circle with Dusty wagging his tail beside them. They were a family made from shattered parts, who had come to realize that being broken together was far better than being whole and all alone. Later that night, long after Emma was asleep in her bed, Eli and Kate sat together on the porch. The Texas sky was filled with bright stars in the cool spring air, and the scent of new growth was all around them. I got a letter in the mail today, Kate said quietly. It was from the territorial governor. The Wade Mining Company is officially shut down. Marshal Coulter's work brought to light all their crooked dealings, from bribes and threats to faked legal documents. She paused for a breath. Wade and Carter fled to California just before the federal warrants arrived. The governor put out an order for their arrest, but they are beyond his jurisdiction now. The mines are being auctioned off. Every penny is going to the families they harmed, to cover medical bills and other losses. So they just slipped away, Eli said, his voice low. They lost every single thing that gave them power. Their influence, their reputation, their hold on this town. Kate's voice turned as hard as iron. And they can never set foot here again. As far as I am concerned, that is justice. That is right. It is more than right. It is the kind of justice that Thomas deserved, and Emma, and every other person Wade ran over. She reached out and took Eli's hand. None of this could have happened if it were not for you. You realize that, do you not? And none of it would have happened without Thomas, Eli answered. He was the one who collected all the evidence, who wrote it all down, who made sure you had everything you needed to fight them. Thomas is the one who began this fight. You are the one who finished it. Eli's gaze fell to the old, faded scar on his wrist, and he traced its shape with his thumb. The motion was a habit now, something that no longer brought him pain. For 8 years, I ran from the fact that I was 30 seconds too slow to save Tommy, he said softly. For 8 years, I believed I had failed the one person in my life who mattered more than anyone. He turned to look at Kate. But I was not 30 seconds too slow this time. I was right on time. I came along at the very moment you and Emma needed someone. Kate leaned in and gave him a kiss. a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of the promise of all their tomorrows. "You had perfect timing," she whispered against his lips. "You rescued us, and we rescued you right back. That is just how these things are supposed to work." They sat there together while the stars made their slow journey across the night sky, until the moon dipped below the horizon, and the first light of dawn began to touch the world. It was a new morning, a new beginning, a new purpose. Elijah Cross had spent 8 years walking the earth like a man already in his grave. But now, he was finally living. Now, he was finally home. He was right where he had always been meant to be.